or good afternoon if you're joining us on the East Coast. The Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife will now come to order. We are meeting today to hear testimony on the status of drought conditions throughout the western United States. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at the hearing will be limited to the chairman and ranking member. This will allow us to hear from witnesses sooner and keep members on schedule. I therefore ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, it is so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions should be submitted to the electronic repository at this email address, hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Additionally, please note that as with in-person meetings, members are responsible for their own microphones. Members will be muted by staff only if it's necessary to avoid inadvertent background noise. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform committee staff immediately. I will now recognize myself for 5 minutes. We're here today for an oversight hearing to discuss current drought conditions across the West, and today's hearing will be informed by an emergency drought summit and drought forums that I've hosted over the past month, where we've heard about the significant toll this drought is taking on communities, tribes, local economies, and native fish and wildlife. This hearing is about continuing our work to identify the most critical drought response needs and to help connect those in need with available resources to get them through a crippling drought. Right now, we're seeing drought conditions affecting tens of millions of people across the entire West, including in the Missouri River Basin, the Rio Grande, Pacific Northwest, and the Colorado River Basin. These conditions are causing severe harm to municipal supplies, to agriculture, fishing communities, numerous tribes, and our freshwater ecosystems and native fish and wildlife. This drought is also contributing to significant wildfire risk. So today we'll talk about ways we can provide short-term drought relief, including through direct aid from federal, state, and local sources. We'll also talk about the imperative of resiliency, preparing our communities for climate change-induced drought in the medium and the long term. Climate change is making drought more frequent and severe. We know that. And we must help communities prepare now for the new normal of longer and more frequent dry conditions. Pretending that there are simple fixes, that if we just weaken environmental laws or build another huge dam, that this problem will go away, that's a form of denial that we cannot afford to indulge. As we heard during our March water infrastructure hearing dealing with these conditions, and unfortunately, federal investment in water infrastructure has simply not kept pace with the need. Over the past 40 years, the federal government's share of water infrastructure spending has fallen from 63% of total capital spending to just 9% in recent years. So new investment is needed, especially in drought-proof water supply projects like reuse and recycling and desalination. We have to invest in water conservation, water use efficiency projects, and modern water storage, including groundwater recharge. Preparing for dry climate conditions has to also include investments in healthy freshwater ecosystems and solutions to close the tribal water access gap. Now, last Congress, this subcommittee advanced some collaborative policy solutions to tackle these challenges. Many of these provisions were enacted into law, including provisions to help address the Bureau of Reclamation's aging infrastructure assets, investments in innovative desalination research, support for new technologies to provide more accurate data on snowpack and runoff forecasting, and support for aquatic ecosystem restoration projects. We also passed some water rights settlements, including the largest tribal water rights settlement ever enacted by Congress. But more must be done. Last Thursday, I reintroduced a comprehensive Western Water Bill, the Future Western Water Infrastructure and Drought Resiliency Act. It was developed over the course of several years through an open online public process that garnered extensive feedback from a variety of stakeholders, and it has been endorsed by stakeholders throughout the community of water users and those affected by water supply planning. Before I recognize Ranking Member Benz, let me just say that this bill is comprehensive. I want to emphasize that the new infrastructure investments it calls for include storage, recycling, desalination, and drinking water projects for underserved communities. It makes investments to improve water technology and data, to restore ecosystems, and to support career education and workforce development in this sector. I know that many of my colleagues have put their own drought response bills together. And if we pass this legislation and some of these other bills, we can generate enough new water supply each year to support millions of people. And we need to move forward on that objective. One project we'll hear about today is a huge regional water recycling project in the Colorado River Basin. If we build this project, it can recycle and deliver enough new drought-proof water for approximately 1 million people every year. Projects like this can be advanced and expedited with more federal support, and we should do that. Now, before I recognize Ranking Member Benz and our witnesses, I want to address the critical drought facing my district and the Klamath River Basin. This Klamath Basin drought is one of the worst in the country right now. And tribes in my district are facing especially difficult circumstances, including the Yurok tribe who's joining us today. The drought is impacting the tribe's ability to supply drinking water. It's hurting tribal business and farming operations, and it is battering an already devastating tribal fishery. Since time immemorial, the Yurok tribe way of life has revolved around the Klamath River and its salmon runs, including many of its traditions and ceremonies. But on the reservation today, where the median income is $11,000, many tribal families who rely on the fishery to pay their basic bills will not have that income coming in. And so Yurok fisheries will be closed once again. Worse than that, deadly fish disease has broken out in the river and is killing most of the baby salmon in the river. Those are the salmon that will be needed to support the fishery in coming years. So federal, state, and local assistance is urgently needed in the Klamath Basin, including for tribes and downstream communities. I want to also acknowledge the farm communities upstream in Ranking Member Benz's district. Upstream communities are facing major hardships and challenges to their livelihood. We need equitable, short-term financial assistance for upstream communities as well. But for the long term, it's important in the Klamath Basin that leaders in upstream and downstream communities come together to find a path forward that breaks the status quo of constant litigation, risk, and uncertainty over water that plagues all sides year after year. With that, I'd like to recognize Ranking Member Benz, and then I understand Ranking Member Westerman would like to make an opening statement after that, so we'll get to him right after Ranking Member Benz.
Thank you, Chair Huffman, so much for holding this hearing. We appreciate this focus on the important issue of Western drought. The extent of the drought is massive, currently impacting at least 70 million people, and it will sadly likely get worse. My congressional district of Central and Eastern Oregon is experiencing firsthand the severe drought and the long-term failure of policy to mitigate against such drought. In the Klamath Basin, just as you mentioned, Chair Huffman, everyone up and down the watershed, from farmers to homeowners to waterfowl and fish, are suffering. And in fact, the main canal of the Klamath Project that diverts water from Klamath Lake has been shut off for the first time in its 116-year history, drying out some 220,000 acres of prime farmland. The uncertainty surrounding water supply has been lasting for decades, despite time, attention, and money from successive administrations. This situation should not be acceptable to anyone in the basin. And this uncertainty shouldn't be acceptable either to those in the California Central Valley, the 7-state Colorado River Basin, and the rest of the West. So this risk shouldn't also be acceptable to the American grocery shopper, who will soon feel the impacts of drought in the form of higher prices and shortages of many things people have been taken for granted as being raised here in America. We often talk, particularly during the age of COVID, about supply chain disruptions. We're about ready to have one when it comes to food in our nation. Many of our fruits, nuts, vegetables, and beef are grown and raised in the West, supplying grocery stores nation and worldwide. Without water, food simply doesn't grow. And without water, we'll have to rely on foreign food sources. And the drought will sadly also help fuel the dry conditions in our overgrown and mismanaged national forests, causing dangerous conditions and the sad, predictable forest fires, massive carbon emissions that go with them, and incredible air quality problems. A drought, of course, isn't new to anyone. It's been around since the beginning of time, but humankind has demonstrated the ability to capture and store water for use in times when it's dry. It's one of the reasons our nation created the Bureau of Reclamation. But times have changed. Sadly, we haven't invested when we should have in, and the Endangered Species Act and other laws reallocate water to fish and aquatic creatures rather than to humans. And we've yet to deal with this change. And sadly, we also continue to have dwindling fish populations. The status quo simply isn't working. What's going on in the drought-plagued West is sad, but we should use this opportunity to assess our policies, come together, just as was mentioned by Chair Huffman, and make long-term changes. So solutions. The focus of today is hopefully about ensuring that we will not repeat the failures that brought us here, and hopefully we'll focus on solutions. Short-term solutions can involve funding to help mitigate against the drought, and of course, necessary conservation will come into play. But short-term funding and conservation simply cannot solve all of our water problems, nor will adding even more costs and regulation to our water infrastructure. Cleaning up our watersheds on a large scale and building or expanding existing dams are just a few of the long-term things that we can do. We are fortunate to have at least two witnesses with us here today who enjoy a deep understanding of these issues, and they will provide meaningful testimony. Congressman Fulcher will introduce his witness, State Forester Craig Moss, later in the hearing, but I have the pleasure of welcoming Dan Keppen, who is not only a constituent of mine from Klamath Falls, Oregon, but is also the executive director of the Family Farm Alliance, which represents Western irrigated agriculture. Dan is not a stranger to this subcommittee for a reason. His dedication to improving the Western way of life and bringing a positive attitude with real solutions that help urban and rural America make him a frequent and welcome guest to our committee. Welcome once again, Dan. This hearing will not make it rain, but I hope, just like the Republican Drought Forum we held last week, that it serves as another education tool for those not familiar with drought and provides another real step and real impetus toward long-term solutions. I hope we can work together across the aisle in an open and transparent way. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Benz. We'll now recognize the Ranking Member of the full committee, Bruce Westerman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you also to Chairman Grijalva for holding this hearing today. It's a very important subject. The drought is coming. If it were a train, the light's very visible. It's on the way. We know from snowpack data and precipitation data that we've got a huge drought headed towards the west unless there's some kind of intervention on that this year. I'd like to echo what Ranking Member Bentz said about our drought forum that we held last week, where we had 18 Republican members and 12 witnesses. We, I think, took a very proactive approach on that, and we got a lot of good stakeholder feedback from that. And Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter the testimonies from our 12 witnesses into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. These testimonies highlight the critical impacts that drought is having on Western communities and offer potential policy solutions to address this problem in the near term as well as the long term. And, drought doesn't have a blue hat or a red hat. It's not a Republican or Democrat. It affects everyone. And I think this is definitely something we should work across the aisle to address this problem. And I think we've got a lot of ideas on how to address it in the long term. Drought is not something that I have to deal with a lot in my home state of Arkansas, although we do have some dry summers. We normally have plenty of water throughout all 4 seasons. But like everyone here knows, the West is different. Its rivers have historically gone through boom and bust cycles, prompting the construction of dams and reservoirs to capture water in wet times for the dry times. These projects not only provided multiple benefits, including cold water for fisheries for the West, but also continue to provide water that grows food for the rest of us. For generations, the project served their intended purposes. But as we heard at last week's forum, many of our policies in the last generation have failed to drought-proof much of the region in these modern times. Our current policies fail to measure accountability and results for environmental actions, and our bureaucracy has paralysis by analysis when it comes to building new infrastructure. We put a man on the moon in less time than it takes to study a new dam project in today's world. We need to have some focus and prioritization on these projects. We need an all of the above water strategy, as I mentioned, that includes new storage, innovation, conservation, and regulatory streamlining. And we can certainly do better when it comes to managing many of our national forests. Forest and water are dependent on one another. Healthy forest means more water quality and more water quantity. And on the other hand, an unhealthy, burned out forest means the opposite, poor water quality and poor water quantity. We've known this for a long time. At the time, many of our Western national forests are subject to catastrophic wildfire, and they're on the verge of igniting due to poor management. We need to pass solutions like we've proposed in the Trillion Trees Act. It's a bipartisan bill that promotes better management of our forests, and it also includes Representative Benz's SOS for Seedlings Act. We also need to work on bills like the Resilient Federal Forest Act and Mr. Fulcher's bill to fix the Good Neighbor Authority legislation. That's just to name a few. There's a lot of areas we should be able to work on in a bipartisan manner to address drought. We are fortunate today to have Idaho State Forester here testifying on how we can be proactive. We have solutions on the table and we're ready to work. Mr. Chairman, I understand that you just reintroduced your water legislation that didn't go through regular order in the last Congress, but was put into a larger bill. I hope that this scenario isn't repeated in this Congress, that we can work together constructively and proactively, and that we can come up with, again, bipartisan solutions that address drought. And we have the ability to overcome these droughts, but we must have the political will to act. We must have a long-term strategy, and we must put the science and the interest of people and the environment at the front of the table. The American people deserve nothing less. With that, I look forward to today's hearing. I go back.
I thank the ranking member, and we will now transition to our first panel of witnesses for today. Before I introduce the witnesses, let me remind non-administration witnesses that they're encouraged to participate in the Witness Diversity Survey created by the Congressional Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Witnesses may refer to their hearing invitation materials for further information about that. Under our committee rules, you must limit your oral statements to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin speaking, you will see the timer start counting down. It will turn orange when you have 1 minute left, and I recommend that members and witnesses who are joining us remotely use the grid view in their software so that they can lock the timer on their screen. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise. I'll allow all witnesses to testify before we begin questioning. And for our first panel of government witnesses, we will hear first from Ms. Elizabeth Klein, a senior counselor to the Secretary of Interior. After Ms. Klein, we will hear from Mr. Craig McLean, acting chief scientist of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. After that, we'll hear from Mr. Joaquin Esquivel. He chairs the California State Water Resources Control Board. And then we will hear testimony from Ms. Amy Cordalis, counsel for the Yurok tribe. Finally, we will hear from Craig Foss, state forester at the Idaho Department of Lands. The chair now recognizes Ms. Klein to testify for 5 minutes.
Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member Bentz, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the status of drought conditions throughout the Western United States. I'm Liz Klein, Senior Counselor to the Secretary at the Department of the Interior. The committee has my written statement, so I'll use this time to make just a few points on how the department is addressing drought. First, several members of the subcommittee and a number of our state and tribal partners had asked the secretary to identify someone within her office who can work across the department on drought issues in places like the Klamath Basin, California, and elsewhere. The secretary has asked me to fill that role, and I'm honored to do so with the help of the many experts who serve along with me at Interior. Next, let me just turn to some numbers. In California, we're approaching the driest year since we started recording in 1896. Water years 2020 and 2021 are the second driest two-year period on record. In the Colorado River Basin, we're undergoing the driest 21-year period in over 100 years of record keeping and one of the longest drought cycles in the past 1,200 years. So while droughts are not new, many of you are experiencing the impacts of one of our driest water years on record. The scale and intensity of this drought is really historic. And when we have water demand exceeding supply, a situation likely to become more and more frequent and severe with climate change, the competing demands for water can lead to more and more conflict. So recognizing the severity of this year's conditions in particular, the Biden-Harris administration's National Climate Task Force announced the formation of an interagency working group to address worsening drought conditions and support farmers, tribes, and communities impacted by ongoing water shortages. This drought relief working group, co-chaired by Interior and the Department of Agriculture, held its first meeting earlier this month. We discussed leveraging existing relationships and using the working group to build upon the National Drought Resilience Partnership, or NDRP, which was formed to coordinate funding and programs across the federal family. Part of our efforts through the NDRP will be to identify both short-term emergency relief, but also longer-term resilience strategies. Additionally, the administration has identified investments that could be made by the American Jobs Plan to help build more resilient communities through efforts such as water efficiency and recycling programs and tribal water settlements. And where there are sensible and environmentally responsible opportunities to invest in new infrastructure, we will. We'll also devote additional resources to maintain and repair what we have. We're aware that addressing our challenges must be done with a comprehensive and coordinated approach that uses all of our available tools. The Department's Water Smart program is one such tool that can help local water suppliers increase their system's resilience to drought and climate change. The program provides multiple paths for adaptation strategies, including multi-benefit projects that support agriculture, cities, tribes, and the environment. Water Smart benefits are realized through projects that increase water supplies in times of drought, through comprehensive drought planning, and through water conservation and reuse. For example, just this past February, Reclamation announced the selection of 18 Water Smart drought resiliency grants, investing over $15 million in federal funds for infrastructure improvements and water management tools to increase water supply reliability and build drought resilience. As productive as these investments have been, we know there's always more that can be done when facing persistent drought conditions. Conservation must also be one of the tools in our toolbox. For example, we have approximately 2.8 million acre-feet of intentionally created surplus water in Lake Mead. Without the water conservation undertaken by U.S. and Mexican water users, the lower Colorado River Basin would likely have been in shortage conditions as early as 2015. This demonstrates the extraordinary importance of taking proactive, cooperative measures to protect limited water supplies. So thank you, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member Bentz. We appreciate Congress's attention to the severity of drought and welcome your input on all of the tools and approaches to help the communities we all serve. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Ms. Klein. The chair now recognizes Mr. McLean to testify for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member Bentz, Chairman Grijalva, Ranking Member Western, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify here today on NOAA's role and on drought conditions across the United States. I serve as NOAA's acting chief scientist and my permanent position as assistant administrator for oceanic and atmospheric research. The current U.S. seasonal drought outlook is produced by NOAA's Climate Prediction Center and presented weekly in the U.S. Drought Monitor. Today, the outlook is concerning. Nearly 40% of the United States is experiencing at least moderate drought. Across much of the Southwest, California, parts of the Northwest Pacific, Missouri River Basin, the drought footprint is significantly worse. Severe drought to exceptional drought status continues throughout much of the Southwest United States. NOAA's archives at the National Centers for Environmental Information report that this past year has been for Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and Utah their driest in 126 years. Of course, California and Colorado had their third and fourth driest respectively. Snowpack is well below average across the Southwest, California, Utah, and portions of Nevada and Colorado. And snow drought and early snow melt have raised serious concerns about water this summer. NOAA's drought products are rooted upon our agency's world-class climate science and services that we provide to the public. We produce daily weather forecasts, climate outlooks well beyond the decades. But the subseasonal to seasonal forecasts, a period defined between 2 weeks and 2 years, often includes the most telling components of drought outlooks. These complex weather and climate forecasts are developed by continuous measurements of the land, the atmosphere, and of ocean patterns as far away as the Indian Ocean. These are all brought together in our detailed computational models. Another way of saying this, if you'd like, is that if you enjoy your 7-day weather forecast, thank an oceanographer. Accurate long-term forecasts of local events requires knowledge of the global system. From global to local, that is what NOAA does. NOAA serves the public. We provide drought information statements, drought outlooks, and we perform research to improve these and other tools. NOAA is the steward of past weather and climate data, and we provide wide ranges of tools such as the all-new one-stop drought.gov. Within NOAA, the National Integrated Drought Information System, or NIDIS, is at the forefront of drought research, education, and building partnerships. First authorized in 2006, NIDIS was created to bring about a united federal, tribal, state, and local network to create a national early drought warning system. Through the 8 regional drought early warning systems nationwide, NIDIS network ensures the successful implementation and appropriate decision-making. The demand for better water resources gave rise to NOAA's new national water model. This continental-scale water prediction model covers nearly 3.5 million miles of rivers and streams. It provides high-resolution hydrologic guidance and significantly expands geographic coverage. NOAA has also created the Forecast-Informed Reservoir Operations, or FIRO. This is improving reservoir forecast information for and with partners in the U.S. Corps of Engineers, the Bureau of Reclamation, U.S. Geological Survey, California Department of Water Resources, Sonoma County, Orange County, and the Yuba Water Agency, among others. This method is simple. NOAA meteorologists and hydrologists integrate water and weather forecasts into water management tools rather than relying on historic norms. Drought can also impact wildland fires. Local weather drives daily fire activities, but the timing, the intensity, and the frequency of drought and other climate events can have wildly divergent paths and impacts on the fuel and fire behavior. NOAA's Drought and Wildland Fire Nexus, or NDAWN, helps meet the needs and challenges of fire managers. NDAWN has real-time benefits for both wildland firefighters, public health, public safety officials in fire-prone areas across the West. To conclude, predicting drought requires the understanding and modeling of global conditions that lead to the onset or relief from local drought. We're well aware of the need to help people suffering from drought today while preparing for the droughts of tomorrow and improving our scientific capabilities. Warmer, drier conditions are expected to increase in the future, leading to extended and more severe drought and fire seasons. We're committed to doing our best at the federal, state, tribal, and local levels. We cannot create the water, but we will continue to do our best to tell you where and when it is coming. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Mr. McLean. The chair now recognizes Mr. Esquivel for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, Ranking Member, and members of the committee for giving me the opportunity to be here today. My name is Joaquin Esquivel, Chair of the California State Water Resources Control Board, and I wish to briefly share California's experiences facing drought conditions and the actions we have taken to adapt to drought. As you've heard, California and the entire West is seeing rapidly developing extreme hydrologic conditions. Our 2021 water year is now likely the 3rd driest year in a 100-year record, with the last 2 years being the 2nd driest 2-year period on record. This spring, the Sacramento, Feather, and American River watersheds, which feed major reservoirs of the state and federal water projects, experienced an accelerated rate of snowmelt, and much of that snowpack seeped into very dry earth rather than flowing into our rivers, streams, and reservoirs, conditions we're seeing throughout the West. These and other factors reduce water supplies for our two major projects by more than 685,000 acre feet. That's enough to supply more than 1 million households with water for a year. In April, Governor Newsom issued an emergency drought proclamation in the Russian River watershed and directed state agencies to take immediate action to bolster drought resilience and prepare for impacts on communities, businesses, and ecosystems statewide. In May, as dry conditions further developed, Governor Newsom expanded this drought emergency proclamation to include the Klamath River, the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, and Tulare Lake watersheds. As a state and our community leaders shift into drought management, we know it's important to build resiliency in our most vulnerable communities. We need to protect public health and safety, balance impacts to our natural and human systems, and help adapt our state's diverse economies, including that of agriculture and its workers. It's because of California's lessons learned in previous drought that we're taking steps such as identifying water suppliers at risk of running out of water, updating the Department of Water Resources dry well website, streamlining our water rights transfer processes, issuing early warning letters to water rights holders, urging them to plan for potential shortages, and investing in conservation. We've also recently completed the state's first comprehensive drinking water needs assessment, which identified small water systems and domestic wells that are at risk of failing to meet the state's drinking water standards. Using 21st century technologies, better data, and a greater understanding of our watershed's functions from headwaters to the ocean and all the cities and farms and ecosystems in between are really critical to making better and more informed decisions that balance all the critical needs of water within the state, in particular our fragile delta. Our state and federal agencies are taking collective action to modify and adapt to changing conditions and the major hydrologic deficits facing the Central Valley and State Water Project. Part of these modifications include pursuing the relaxation of water quality standards the projects would otherwise meet, known as temporary urgency change petitions, and the expedited construction of salinity intrusion barriers in the Delta to help the state maintain upstream storage levels. Unfortunately, we've also reached the point where the state now needs to curtail some water users because there is simply not enough water available to fulfill even the most senior rights. The governor's emergency proclamation provides my agency, the State Water Board, with the authority to implement curtailments on an emergency basis. But just as it has become clear that drought is an increasingly persistent feature of California hydrology, so has a need to more nimbly manage our water system during these times of shortage. The state will need to invest heavily in enhanced data and data systems and standardized curtailment and water availability methodologies if we are to effectively and equitably manage our precious water resources over the long term. The Water Board, the Department of Water Resources, and the Department of Fish and Wildlife and our federal colleagues will continue to look at ways to conserve storage at our major reservoirs this year so we can provide cold water as best when needed, curtail water rights to match water availability, and maintain water quality in the Delta for in-Delta uses, and facilitate transfers, all while working to plan ahead for conditions next year. Droughts, floods, wildfires, and extreme weather continue to demonstrate that our 20th century infrastructure is colliding with the reality of our 21st century climate crisis. However, as we read nationally about fundamental infrastructure systems failing due to extreme climate, it's clear we have a generational opportunity to rebuild those systems. That is why Governor Gavin Newsom has proposed in his May budget revise a $5.1 billion drought package, and that includes $1.3 billion in American Rescue Plan Act funds for drinking water and wastewater infrastructure. This down payment on California's water infrastructure, in addition to a $1 billion water debt relief program to help households and communities pull out from economic downturn and ease the burden of a water shutoff moratorium enacted to protect public health during the pandemic. These investments will go to drinking water, again, wastewater, water recycling, groundwater cleanup, and improvements to water supply and ecosystem security, quality, and reliability. Improvements to water conveyance as well, and importantly, respond to in emergency and permanent fashion to solutions for drinking water and drought emergencies. All of these investments will help build drought resiliency. But as we know from our recent drinking water needs assessment, there is still much work to be done in fulfilling the human right to clean water and sanitation. In many ways, we're faced here with a reconciliation of our inherited systems built for a different climate, and systems that often unthinkingly perpetuate our less enlightened past. California stands ready to partner with our federal government to invest and recommit to a just, equitable, and climate resilient 21st century America. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Esquivel. The chair now recognizes Amy Cordalis of the Yurok tribe to testify for 5 minutes. I told you about the Yurok tribe earlier in my opening statement. I did not mention that they are the largest tribe in California. Of course, they're in my district. I did mention that, but this is a tribe that is bearing a huge amount of hardship as a result of the drought conditions in the lower Klamath. They have treaty rights, fishing rights, and water rights that are not being satisfied. So very important that we hear their perspective, and they're represented by a very capable general counsel in Amy Cordalis. So welcome to the subcommittee. Ms. Cordalis, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
I agree. Thank you, Chairman and distinguished committee members. My name is Amy Cordalis. I am counsel to the Yurok tribe, a tribal member, and also principal of the Ridges to Riffles Conservation Fund. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. As the chair mentioned, the Yurok tribe is the largest tribe in California. Our reservation straddles the lower 45 miles of the Klamath River in the true northern California. Since time immemorial, the Yurok Lifeway has centered around the Klamath River. Drought puts our natural resources and way of life at risk. I have 3 points to make today. The first, as a short-term measure, any drought relief package must include equitable funding to tribal governments like the Yurok to respond to hardships caused by drought. The Yurok Reservation is in one of the most remote areas in California. We are hundreds of miles away from state or federal offices. The tribal government responds to emergencies like drought. In the next few months, we anticipate hundreds of homes will be without drinking water because the streams will run dry. Fire risk is extremely high. Last year, the Yurok Reservation was surrounded by wildfires for days and experienced the worst air quality on the planet. Students from the Six Rivers Montessori Elementary School painted pictures of this event, which I see are displayed now. Thank you. For a full 2 weeks, the reservation and surrounding areas were covered in a shroud of smoke. Many community members are still suffering from the health problems caused by such poor air quality. We anticipate this will happen again and are making preparations. Second, any legislative package must include equitable funding to help tribal commercial fishermen and their families survive the drought. Fish disease is rampant on the Klamath River. We have already lost nearly an entire class of baby salmon from fish disease. This will have long-term impacts on the Klamath stocks, reducing the size of future harvests available to tribal and offshore commercial fishermen. Adding insult to injury, the remaining and the returning 2021 adult salmon class is historically low. As a conservation measure, the tribe canceled its 2021 commercial fishery. This is the 5th year in a row the tribe has not had a viable commercial fishery, and we have lost millions of dollars as a result. Third, long-term drought solutions need to prioritize ecosystem resilience. Watersheds throughout the West are overdeveloped, overappropriated, and overstressed. We have overbuilt infrastructure, overpromised water supplies to the detriment of our own health and the planet. On the Klamath, every year, water demand exceeds water supply, and the fish, the ecosystem, are repeatedly provided bare minimums. This approach, along with drought, has put salmon on a trail towards extinction. Historically, the Klamath River was the 3rd largest salmon-producing river on the West Coast. Tragically, it's estimated only 2 to 5% of the salmon runs remain today. The salmon have been annihilated by the federal government's development and operation of the Klamath Reclamation Project, Klamath River Dams, the Trinity River Division, and water diversions on key tributaries such as the Shasta and the Scott Rivers. These projects have destroyed salmon habitat, reduced in-stream flows to bare minimums, and resulted in management regimes that prioritize agricultural diversions over the needs of fish and ecosystems. Drought exacerbates these problems by threatening to reduce minimum in-stream flows to levels experts will predict will not only kill more salmon, but result in the ecological collapse of the Klamath River. On the Klamath, we have a saying I think could be helpful to guide the West as we plan. What is good for fish is good for farmers. We must plan for drought, and our plans must equally value the needs of our planet with our own, because the two are the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cordalis. The chair now recognizes Mr. Foss, our final panelist, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member Bentz, and members of the subcommittee for holding this hearing today and for the opportunity to testify on behalf of the state of Idaho Department of Lands. I'm Craig Foss, Idaho State Forester, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today regarding the relationship of drought, wildfire, and our federal, state, and private forests. As State Forester for the Idaho Department of Lands, I oversee the forestry and fire programs for the state of Idaho. IDL staff provide professional assistance to the citizens of Idaho, enabling them to use, protect, and sustain their natural resources while protecting soil and water quality, reducing the risks of catastrophic wildfire, and providing access to necessary use of fire for forest restoration and community protection. Idaho's forest lands are essential to providing drinking water for all Idahoans. Healthy forests bring increased water supplies through snow retention in mountain headwaters and increased stream shading. Unhealthy and fire damaged forests bring water quality and quantity issues. Healthy, resilient forests can withstand naturally occurring disturbances such as insect and disease outbreaks, wildfire, and drought. Idaho's national forests comprise 80% of our state's forest land. Of these more than 20 million acres of federal forests, 12.8 million are designated as suitable for management. And of those 12.8 million acres, 75%, more than 8 million acres, are in declining condition, leaving them at high risk of insect disease and wildfire mortality. Idaho, like much of the West, is experiencing wildfire seasons that are 30 to 60 days longer due to the changing climate. We can't change the weather, but we can change the condition of our forests. In Idaho, we've entered into shared stewardship and good neighbor authority agreements with the goal of doubling the number of acres treated and restored on our most at-risk federal forest lands. Adjacent industrial and family forest land will also be treated, assuring landscape-scale forest health improvements. These agreements involve a wide array of federal, state, county, NGO, and other private interests. Treatments will include harvest of commercially viable forests, prescribed fire on landscapes that are not suitable for mechanical treatments, and reforestation with suitable forest species. Federal and state nurseries have capacity, but they lack funding to significantly increase seedling production to meet the increased reforestation needs across the West. The goal of reforestation is removal of dead and dying trees and the thinning of overcrowded forests and ladder fuels contributing to wildfire spread, thus assuring the remaining healthy trees have access to increasingly limited water supplies and making more water available for aquifer recharge. Idaho is fortunate to have a strong forest industry with forestry consultants, logging contractors, lumber mills, and seedling nurseries serving an integral role in this restoration effort. It will take many years to address the extensive restoration work needed to restore and protect our forested watersheds, both in Idaho and throughout the Western United States. This can't be accomplished without consistent national policy support. It will require increased funding for climate change research, active forest management, wildfire mitigation, increased use of prescribed fire, and reforestation. Additionally, the Trillion Trees Act, the Resilient Federal Forests Act, the Treating Tribes and Counties as Good Neighbors Act, the Rural Forest Markets Act, and the National Prescribed Fire Act all contain important policy and funding tools needed by federal and state forestry agencies engaged in these essential forest restoration efforts. These are all important policy initiatives, and the more they can be streamlined, the more efficiently the directives can be implemented by agencies on the ground. The critical point that I want to stress today is that managed forests are healthy forests. They're better able to withstand wildfire, pests, and drought, and they're more capable of storing carbon, providing clean air, water, wildlife habitat, economic and recreational opportunities, and countless other benefits. Forests, water, and people are dependent upon one another. I look forward to answering your questions today. And again, I thank you for the opportunity to testify.
Thank you very much, Mr. Foss. Let me remind the members of the committee that Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions, and we will now turn to members' questions. I will begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. And Ms. Klein, I'd like to begin with you, and we'll start with a little bit of a softball. I know that President Biden's American Jobs Plan includes funding to respond to the Western drought crisis. Why is investing in Western water infrastructure an important part of this legislation?
Thank you, Chairman, for the question. I think this administration is keenly interested in making investments through the American Jobs Plan, which outlines really a long-term strategy to create more resilient communities, to address a changing climate, to ensure that the infrastructure we have is modernized, that we're using 21st century tools to predict what may happen across years for people to make better decisions across a landscape. It's really the type of long-term vision that I think we probably could all agree that there needs to be in terms of improving our infrastructure across the country and investing in tools that I referred to in my opening statement, including water efficiency and water recycling programs, tribal water settlements, and all of the various tools that we might use to address both drought and also catastrophic wildfires that continue to plague our communities across the West in particular.
Thank you. Let's turn to the short-term needs, the dire needs that we've heard about from this panel. I want to commend Interior for recently committing $18 million in drought relief to irrigators and tribes in the Klamath Basin, but more relief is definitely needed in the Klamath and throughout the West. Can you inform the committee of any other legal authorities or options that you have available that could be used to provide additional short-term financial relief to drought-impacted communities and tribes?
So part of what we're hoping to do through the National Drought Resilience Partnership, or NDRP, is really task all agencies across the federal government. That partnership includes about 13 federal agencies to look at what existing programs they have that could support emergency relief. So this includes agencies like not just Interior and Ag, which co-chair the Immediate Drought Working Group, but also our colleagues at NOAA, EPA, Department of Defense, the Army Corps of Engineers. We're really hoping to look across the federal family to find what existing support can be brought to bear this year. We obviously are, as we'll talk more about today, stretched not just in the Klamath Basin, but in other areas of California and really across the West, facing pretty dire situation. And we want to find every possible means of support to provide emergency relief, to ensure that folks have access to water supply and access to clean water.
Thank you. You've heard from one of the downstream tribes in the Klamath Basin that's being devastated by the impacts of drought and water management decisions. Would you please tell the committee about the department's tribal trust obligations and tribal treaty rights and how that factors into management decisions in the Klamath Basin?
Thank you for that question. We certainly take our trust and treaty obligations seriously. The Department of the Interior, Secretary Holland, understands that we serve as trustees for tribes across the country. And the resources like salmon and water supply are part of those trust and treaty obligations that Ms. Cordalis spoke of. And so we take those very seriously. We came into office and immediately issued some directives around making sure that we are engaging in meaningful tribal consultation. And so that's definitely a priority for the department every single day.
Ms. Cordalis, did you want to add anything from the tribal perspective about that?
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you, Ms. Klein, for that response. And we've been pleased to engage the Biden administration on exercising its trust responsibility. We look forward to the future of that and making sure that when it comes to drought planning, that the tribal trust resources are protected. The federal government has a trust responsibility to the Yurok tribe to protect our fishery, and historically has not exercised that trust responsibility in the proper way. I'll say the federal government made a promise to my ancestors when the reservation was created in 1855 to preserve our way of life, our fishing way of life. And as I reported in my testimony, there are only 2 to 5% of the historic salmon runs left in the river. We have never had the opportunity to have a modern fishing way of life. And unfortunately, the federal government has had a big hand in why that is the case. So as we look forward, we have to think about ecosystem resiliency. We have to think about what fish need, and we have to be able to plan and use our best available science to plan for how we're going to expand the benefits that these resources can provide, and exercising the trust responsibility, using the tribal treaty rights are a really powerful tool in ecosystem protection and development. And that results in a more equitable America. Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you, Ms. Cordalis. The chair now recognizes the Dean of the House, Congressman Don Young from Alaska, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for having this hearing. This question of drought is not new to me. I've lived in California for many years before I came to Alaska. Thank God I went to Alaska. But having said that, my interest in this is water impoundment, not looked upon very well, better uses of our water, and the necessity of taking consider everything, farming, self-consumption, utilization by the human being, and making sure that there's water for all. And I do believe there is water for all. We've not done a good job of management. We hear a lot about the forest fires. I had the largest forest fire, I believe, in 2020 or 2019 in Alaska. It was 167,000 acres and cost $46 million to do it. And Mr. Foss, in your comment, you mentioned that 75% of the forest acres suitable for management in Idaho are declining conditions. You also mentioned the need for policy support. What kind of support can we do as a Congress for you?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. You know, a couple things. You know, the wildfire funding fix was enacted, came into place a few years ago. One of the expectations with the wildfire funding fix was that with funds that had been diverted when the suppression side of the Forest Service and BLM ran out of money, resources were diverted from other programs, forest management programs on the National Forest System side, and then state and private funds that came to states for forest management. Those funds were being diverted. With the wildfire funding fix, the intent and the thought was that without that diversion taking place, those funds would be available for forest mitigation and hazard fuel reduction efforts. And it is absolutely critical that we be much more aggressive in terms of managing those hazardous fuels and not putting all of our resources just into suppression. So that's one area, is to fully implement the wildfire funding fix as was intended. You know, a second really has to do with our license to operate on the landscape, and that has to do with litigation of forest projects that have been planned collaboratively and are part of a national forest 5 to 10 year forest management plan They've been through a collaborative process. That group has agreed to the management activities that are moving forward. They've conducted the environmental analysis on those projects. And then those projects are litigated by someone outside of that collaborative process. And what that means is projects that everyone has agreed are essential to treating that landscape are not able to be treated because they're tied up in court. And so that really needs to be addressed as well.
I thank you for your comment. I happen to agree that I live through this. Every time we have a managed agreed sale, it's sued by some group on this. Mr. Chairman won't agree with me because he's a lawyer, but I would suggest respectfully, we ought to look at this and see how it's being misused, because you can't manage forest if you're continually stopped by doing so by groups that have really no interest or worked in the negotiation. It's something we ought to look at, because we can't have our cake and eat it too. We have a group of people who say you can't cut any trees down. This is awful. We have a group of people who got to cut them down. I'm just saying, let's look at, we have to manage the forest so we have not only water availability, but a healthy forest. So I thank you for your comment. Mr. Chairman, thank you for this meeting. I say this business of drought, remember last year California had an awful lot of water. This year you don't. Thank God we can't control this in Congress. God does that, but we might have a better look at forest management, and I say impoundment of water. The Auburn Dam should have been raised. It was objected to. The Steel Mountain Dam should have been built. It was not done so. And I go down the line, and we have billions of gallons of water going into the sea, which is raising, and we're not saving it, utilizing it for human activity. So we have to quit looking at humans as being evil and say maybe we can do a little bit of good too. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Young, and even lawyers do some good once in a while. So take it easy on the poor lawyers, please. With that, the chair recognizes the chair of the full committee, Mr. Grijalva from Arizona, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for this hearing. Very important, and I share your thoughts that there is no simplistic response to the droughts that we are confronting out west, that it is a comprehensive response that's needed. And thank you for that and for the legislation. Ms. Klein, tribal water rights, the settlements water rights settlements is one way that we fulfill our tribal trust responsibilities to ensuring tribes have sufficient water supplies to make their homelands viable. The issue has been reliable federal funding streams to implement these water settlements that are many of them currently in the pipeline and waiting. Do you feel that additional deposits into that reclamation water settlement fund, making it permanent in terms of funding, is that one way to address that funding issue and the shortfall that occurs across Indian country on those settlements?
Thank you for that question, Chairman Grijalva. We are absolutely committed to negotiating Indian water rights settlements. They are a crucial way to ensure that tribes have long promised resources available to them. Settlements can often be a better way to pursue that rather than protracted and expensive litigation. We are certainly working, keenly interested in working with you to make sure settlements are funded and implemented as required. So I'm actually chair of the department's Indian Water Rights Settlements Working Group and look forward to working with you and your staff as we move forward.
Thank you, Council. And the good example is in the Colorado Drought Contingency Plan that was advanced out of Congress, that it sunsets in 2026. Tribes were critical in helping put that together, and their importance, I think, shouldn't be overlooked going forward, and I know you won't. The other issue is that at least the Colorado River and the 7 states affected by that, and particularly 4, the 20-year drought required that Colorado River drought contingency plan be put together by the states. And, when you have, as of now, Lake Mead and the large reservoir for the Colorado River largest one at 40% capacity. Lake Powell is kind of reaching levels where it triggers the Department of the Bureau of Reclamation to begin to work with those states to prevent further declines. I mentioned all those things, and our famous legislature here in Arizona decides that their answer to all this is to build a 4,000-mile pipeline from the Missouri River or the Mississippi River to bring water to Arizona. Putting that aside, going forward and looking at the question of comprehensive response that Chairman Huffman mentioned at the beginning, that mega drought, I call it that, will continue, and the pressure will continue on all the users. How do you see that process going forward, and what do you see the role that the department is going to be playing in that?
Well, thank you for that question. The drought contingency plan has certainly been integrally important to the conditions right now along the Colorado River. We, as I noted, we suggest that shortages would have been declared a couple of years ago had it not been for that plan. So we are grateful for that. We are already working to think about our process for post-2026 operations, and we want to make sure that we put together a process that's collaborative and ensures meaningful engagement with tribes who are really important to that process, as well as the basin states, water districts, Mexico, and all the stakeholders who care so deeply about that basin. So we are already thinking about what is going to happen post 2026.
And I anticipate that the discussion that needs to occur, I think, in the states and in that process is the choices that are being confronted in terms of how you prioritize or how you section off users, and I think that discussion needs to occur, and I know the legislation facilitates that, and I know your department is facilitating that, but I think honest discussion with empirical facts is going to be very, very necessary in this process, and I want to thank you for the effort that you're undertaking with that. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the hearing.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva. Now from Arizona, we're going to go upstream in the Colorado River Basin. And I'm guessing that is the beautiful upper Colorado River. And Ms. Bobert's backdrop will recognize the gentlelady from Colorado for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and that is the Colorado River, right from Rifle, Colorado. Thank you, Ranking Member Westerman, and thank you, Ranking Member Bentz. Ms. Klein, I have some questions for you. Thank you so much for being here today. You are testifying today on water-related matters on behalf of the Department of Interior. So we would all presume you have experience in Endangered Species Act matters and water storage matters, which are clearly related to today's hearing, yes or no?
Yes, thank you for the question. Those are certainly issues that are relevant to today's discussion.
That is wonderful. While those are certainly important topics, while researching some of your history, I found some conflicts. And Ms. Klein, the White House pulled your potential nomination to be the deputy secretary because your conflicts of interest were so severe that you faced bipartisan opposition. Has the ethics office at the department provided you with a recusal list? Yes or no?
Thank you for that question. Yes, I and have been consulting on an ongoing basis with our ethics officials and taking my responsibilities and ethics requirements seriously, and I have an ethics agreement that I operate under.
Okay, so you have been provided with a recusal list. Who and what matters are you currently recused from, and would you provide this committee with that full list?
I'm happy to provide a list.
Great, thank you. We will expect that and submit that into the record. Thank you so much. Now let's talk about probably the worst conflict of interest. You were the Deputy Director at the State Energy and Environmental Impact Center at the NYU School of Law, or SEEIC. According to an email that I have here dated August 25th, 2017, SEEIC sent emails to numerous Democrat Attorney General's offices stating that it would provide state AG offices with legal assistance from 3 full-time attorneys, communications help from a full-time communications expert, and that there was funding available to recruit and hire special assistant attorney generals to work as staff for the actual state attorney general's office. So now, please, Ms. Klein, let me get this straight. Michael Bloomberg funneled private money through SEEIC that you used as deputy director to hire and pay special assistant attorney generals that worked for the state AG offices and sued the Trump administration on energy, climate change, and environmental regulations. So basically, SEEIC helped infiltrate state governments with Green New Deal extremists for the sole purposes of suing the federal government on environmental policies you all disagreed with. Yes or no?
Ms. Klein, you're welcome to answer that question, but I do want to advise members that they should keep their questions and remarks limited to the subject matter under consideration in today's hearing. That is under Committee Rule 3D, but please proceed.
Thank you. I'm certainly happy to provide information about the work of the center, where the center can provide you with information about their work. Again, I'm taking my ethics obligations very seriously at the Department of the Interior.
Okay, and thank you for your comment, Mr. Chairman. When senior officials from the Trump administration came before this committee, you were one of the members who asked similar questions about conflicts of interest in order to increase transparency and hold them accountable. And so I'd request the same courtesy. Thank you. Now, Ms. Klein, did SEEIC also make available 3 full-time attorneys to Attorney General offices from different states and or the District of Columbia? Yes or no?
So I take my ethics obligations at the Department of Interior seriously. I work closely with our ethics officials to make sure that I abide by all of my recusal responsibilities.
Reclaiming my time. Thank you so much. It's unfortunate that you're coming before this committee and not providing adequate information. Mr. Chairman, serving at the highest levels of federal agencies is no place for extremist partisan hacks that are compromised by special interests. I'm grateful that Senator Manchin agreed and kept Ms. Klein from being the Deputy Secretary of Interior. Unfortunately, she still managed to slither her way into a high-level position at the department that doesn't require the scrutiny of a public confirmation process. I believe it's incredibly important that Ms. Klein be recused from all matters she directly worked on while in the private sector, that she be recused from all matters being worked on by those she hired and placed in assistant attorney general's offices. And to be honest, this woman is so compromised that she should be recused from working for any American taxpayers, period. Thank you.
The gentlelady's time has expired. And just for the record, Ms. Klein did very clearly state that she would provide all the recusal information and ethics information requested. So there is complete transparency and cooperation. And with respect to the previous administration, the questions were focused on decisions undertaken by the likes of Mr. Bernhardt in his capacity as an interior official, not an inquisition into previous career work. So with that, the chair now recognizes Ms. Napolitano for 5 minutes.
Okay, Mr. Chair. I have several questions. Ms. Klein, recycled water need is mentioned in almost everybody's testimony as one of the tools needed, yet the budget is not commensurate with the need. Why? That's one question. The other question is, in April, you established the Drought Relief Working Group aimed at helping irrigators and tribes. What about the citizens and communities that need the communities of color? And when are those going to be releasing the findings? We've known that drought cycles have been more than 20 years, yet we are a little slow on the draw. Would you please? answer.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for those questions, Congresswoman Napolitano. Water recycling and reuse is absolutely one of the tools that we wish to invest in the Biden-Harris administration to address drought conditions and to create more resilient communities. This administration.
Why is not the funding commensurate with the need?
Well, I think the American Jobs Plan includes investments in water recycling and reuse programs. And, I think you'll find that our upcoming budget proposals will also include proposed investments in these programs.
To what extent? I mean, the budget is 60 million. We need at least $1 billion to be able to keep up with the already authorized projects of recycled water to combat drought. And another question is the stream gauges haven't been maintained in the West, and we need them operable. How many stream gauges are currently operable? Where are they located? How many need repair? And what is the status of them?
So our stream gauge program is absolutely one of our best programs to collect water data and really help decision makers make informed decisions across landscapes.
We know that. I will answer the question.
Yes, ma'am. I will certainly provide information to you and your staff on the exact numbers and their conditions after the hearing.
Committee,
I have it in front of me right now.
The committee, please. Thank you very much. NOAA, Mr. McLean, as you outlined in your testimony, you're working to innovate science to help prepare and respond to droughts. And can you discuss who has access to NOAA research or findings? How is the information shared specifically with college, local water agency, et cetera?
Congresswoman, the science that NOAA provides is free and open to everyone. We aggressively make it.
How do you disseminate the information so people will know that you're available?
Yes, ma'am. We disseminate it directly through tools like the National Drought Information System that I mentioned earlier, through NIDIS. We have drought-based organizations in the RISA programs, the Regional Integrated Science Assessment programs that work in communities and work with people in order to disseminate the knowledge.
I'm sorry, but is that information shared with your universities and other water agencies? I understand what you're saying. You have within the area of your agency and other agencies information, but does everybody know how to access it?
That is one of the purposes of the NIDIS program as was authorized by Congress, and we're working to maximize our exposure. Half of the science that we do, Congresswoman, is performed by university hands and minds. The scientists that provide the research that helps us make these forecasts come from the various universities in cooperative institutes. These are long-term academic arrangements that we have, and we aggressively market that information availability to the drought community. That is the goal of the NIDIS program, and I would look forward to any comments that you might have as to how we could do that better, but we do it quite aggressively. All the information is open. We market that information. We market drought.gov, which is a one-stop shop for citizens, academics, ranging from experts to just curious enthusiasts.
Yes.
How to get our information and where to find it.
I have limited time. I have room for one more question. Mr. Keppen, the family farmlands, what is the percentage of agriculture production exported or leased California? Farm production versus citizen needs?
I'm not sure. Is Mr. Keppen with us? He's in the second panel, Grace.
Oh, okay.
You may want to hold that.
I will look at the Hoover Dam. Is there enough electricity with the second tier of turbines?
This is for Ms. Klein?
Anybody?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
The Hoover Dam was, the turbines were lowered a few years back because there wasn't enough production to the higher elevation of water. And I don't know whether the current turbines are creating electricity or moving to create lower tier of turbines to create electricity.
So, yeah, Ms. Klein, if you know if the lake levels are impacting the turbine generation.
I know that we are certainly watching that issue closely and ensuring that we can provide power generation at the Hoover Dam. I'm certainly happy to have our staff follow up on the specifics of the condition of those turbines.
Thank you. The committee, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Napolitano. The chair now recognizes Ranking Member Westerman for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses again for being here today and engaging on this very important subject. I think we've found ourselves back in a situation that we too often find ourselves in, where we've had a lack of management or a hands-off approach, and now we've got to pay the piper. We've shot ourselves in the foot, and now we've got to take a long hike, and there's going to be some very tough decisions that have to be made because there's only so much water and there's a lot of demands for the water has been recognized in the testimony. And as we look at the short term, it's not a pretty picture for what this summer is going to look like in the West and possibly next summers if this drought continues to carry on. But if we look at the long term, I think that's what our solutions have to be about today. And if you look around this committee, Mr. Chairman, with the jurisdiction that we have on this committee, and then my friend Representative Napolitano, who's the chairman of the Water and Environment Subcommittee on TNI, we have the group of people in Congress, we have the jurisdiction, and I think we could really make a big difference if we could all work together to address these issues, and I hope the majority will stay focused on drought issues in the West. If we look at our decisions for the future, we're either going to have to produce more water or use less of it, or at least change the way we manage the use of that water. And I know Mr. Foss testified about the importance of forestry, and I think people often overlook that. And Mr. Foss, I've been able to visit it's called a micro study project up in northern Idaho, where it looked at the effects of forest management on water quality. I know there's been a lot of studies like that in the past, but can you maybe inform the committee just how significant forestry management is to water supply, and what kind of percentages and increases in water availability could we be looking at if we would simply do the management that we should be doing anyhow?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. One of the situation that we're facing on our forests is due to lack of management, they're severely overstocked. And when you have a dwindling water supply, every plant out there on that landscape and that ecosystem is competing for that increasingly limited amount of water. And so our goal in forest management isn't to eliminate all the trees. Our goal in forest management is to go into those stands that are overstocked and thin those stands so that you have the right species of trees on that landscape at the right spacing so that the trees you want on the landscape can compete for that limited supply of water. And then rather than having trees that you don't need, that aren't healthy, that are competing for that moisture, when those have been eliminated, the water's going to the trees you want, and then the remaining water is made available to go into the water system, into streams and into aquifer recharge. So that's the essence of forest management. And the other benefit to that is that you're taking an unhealthy forest that oftentimes ends up being a carbon emitter, and you're creating forests that are growing healthy and vigorously. They're capturing more carbon dioxide from the air, creating oxygen, and they're becoming carbon sinks, which is something we've all identified as being essential. I think as far as
so you get multiple benefits. You get multiple benefits from that. And could you also elaborate just a little bit more? If you've got an overstocked stand, do some trees get all the water they need and other trees just give it up, or is the water kind of automatically ratioed out among all of the trees so that none of them get the water they need?
Thank you. Yeah, really, it's a competitive system, and what you end up with is is all the trees competing for that limited water source. And so you end up with an overall stand that's much less healthy, much more susceptible to insect and disease outbreaks, insect and disease that are naturally occurring in the landscape. And in a healthy ecosystem, those trees can withstand those existing insect and disease threats. In an unhealthy situation,
It's detrimental to all stand or all trees in the stand when there's limited water supply. And I would love to discuss this more, but I see I'm out of time. I would like to talk about biochar and the benefits it has to water storage and uptake potential. But Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
We will talk about biochar another time, Ranking Member Westerman, for sure. We share an interest in that subject. The chair now recognizes a gentleman from the San Joaquin Valley, Mr. Costa, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for this important hearing the subcommittee's holding and for all the members that are participating. Sadly, this is the fifth drought that I've had to work with my colleagues with, both at the state and the federal level. We are in extreme drought conditions, as has been noted. This may rival the 1976 and 77 drought. And as the State Water Resources Control Board Director noted, over 700,000 acre feet of water that we hoped would be in the system this spring is not, because the ground has been so dry that the snowpack melt instead of going into the reservoirs, seeped into the ground, and it's not available for human use, for the ecosystem or for agriculture, and that's the reality. Obviously, drought is no stranger to the farmers of the San Joaquin Valley and the farm communities. The impacts in the last drought, 2012 to 2014, resulted in 40 to 45% unemployment, and the impacts to farmers and farm workers in these communities was devastating. I want to ask a question as Executive Director Joaquin Esquivel. There are certain requirements that your authority has as it relates to carryover storage targeted on Shasta Reservoir for Coldwater Pool. Many of the farmers down south of the Delta have purchased up to $100 million of water and made concessions to fallow fields, and be sure there are going to be maybe 700,000 acres or more that will be fallowed. But they hope that they can get that water that's being held with salmon temperature management when it's able to be transferred as a lifeline for farmers south of the Delta. Otherwise, certainly there's going to be bankruptcy and farm workers will be out of jobs. Mr. Esquivel, will you commit to making a priority that transfer water be moved at a time when it can provide a beneficial use to these farm communities?
Thank you, Congressman. I appreciate the question and the thoughts. What we have been doing with the state operators and the federal fish agencies is trying to best understand what the system is doing. As you can understand, 700,000 acre foot hole, if you will, and the expectations of how the projects were going to run, and importantly, how water was going to move in the system was really important. And so, we're trying our best to balance out those needs, and are committed to trying our best to preserve what were transfers that were. I'm sorry, apology.
Will you have a timeline? Can we revisit that? My time's running out here.
Of course, yeah, that's fine. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, let's follow up on that, please.
I can definitely get that information.
Ms. Klein, operating conveyance facilities at the original design level will help optimize our options. And the chairman noted his legislation, and I have legislation, there are other bills. But my canal conveyance capacity would also, and Senator Feinstein has a similar bill, would help, and we have state funding that the governor has proposed that would help improve the Frank Kern Canal, the Delta Mendota Canal, and the California Aqueduct. Would you folks support that legislation?
I think we are absolutely committed to looking at how to modernize our aging infrastructure. The Bureau of Reclamation is not young, and we know that a lot of our facilities are in need of modernization and upkeep and maintenance. Well, so we're happy to take a look at that
part of
legislation.
All the water tools in our water toolbox, and I am a big believer in that we need to use all of them, having dealt with this. And there is a playbook, because sadly, with climate change, we've had to deal with drought conditions. And that will be my last question for the gentleman who I think did a very good job in his testimony on managing our forests. I think we have done a poor job in managing our forests for decades now, Mr. Faust. We had a hearing with the subcommittee last fall in the middle of these devastating fires that we had throughout California and throughout the West. And as you noted, we're spending more money on fire suppression than we are on managing our forest lands. The department, and I've brought this up to Secretary Vilsack, estimated in a hearing we held last week last fall that we need $2 to $3 billion annually to really update the U.S. Forest Management Plan. Clearly, we noted in the water supply that we lacked here in California because of the devastating drought, that the trees are suffering. What would your suggestion be?
Well, again, I don't work for the federal government, but I can tell you we have an 80 million acre problem that we're trying to deal with. And I just outlined the severity of the challenge that we're dealing with here in Idaho. And we absolutely do. I mean, suppression resources are essential because we have people out on the landscape and we need to protect them. But we have to do something about the future of this, and we have to start trying to manage away from these problems. And we can do that both through forest harvest, but also through prescribed fire and treating the right landscapes in the right places. If I treat 1,000 acres, I might protect 10,000 acres by treating that right 1,000 acres. And so being really strategic about the acres we're treating, that's a huge emphasis by all states.
Well, that's a good point. My time has run out, Mr. Chairman, but I think this is something we need to look at in terms of, you and I have discussed this, providing more money through the Ag Committee, through the U.S. Forest Service to better manage our forests. That helps water with climate change and all the other factors, and I think this is something we could work on together. You're muted.
Thank you, Mr. Costa. The chair now recognizes Ranking Member Benz for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my first question is going to be for Ms. Klein. And what I'm most interested in is establishing a sense of scale, a sense of scope of this drought. I know we've heard lots about it over the past week and then even in today's hearing, but I just want to mention or ask, is the department doing something to try to call out to the rest of the nation, those who are in more water-blessed areas, for example, what we're facing out here so that we can generate the type of enthusiasm it's going to take to address such a huge problem?
Thank you very much for the question, Ranking Member Benz. We are certainly doing what we can to raise the profile, if you will, all across the country. Secretaries Holland and Vilsack put out joint press statements. We've engaged with, the White House has put out announcements about it, and certainly Secretary Holland speaks about this issue whenever she has an opportunity. So we are trying to raise the profile and make sure that folks understand that we are really in a historic drought situation this year.
Thank you. And just to put a little bit of perspective on it, in my state of Oregon, down in the Little Klamath Basin, at 220,000 acres dried up, it's anticipated and roughly estimated that the loss to that community will be about $400 million. Just in that little community, 200,000 acres, I can't imagine the billions being lost in California, where I think we just heard from Congressman Costa that we're looking at 800,000 acres fallowed, and my goodness, it must be in the billions of loss. And that brings me to this comment, and that's actually a question. It's apparent that the allocation of water to in-stream flows will pit tribe against tribe, fish against fish, fish against agriculture, communities against communities, as people debate who should get what little water is left. In your opinion, what's the proper forum for these life and death arguments? Yeah, obviously the courts are there, but they're slow. It might be 2 years before we get an opinion. What is your department doing to try to step into that space? And if you go to the Drought Relief Working Group, well, I'm fine with that, but please tell me how that's actually going to work on the ground.
Well, we want to use potentially all available tools for communicating and engaging in meaningful discussions with folks. I am grateful to this subcommittee for convening us today to have that discussion. I think these types of conversations are part of that, raising the profile and working to identify solutions. We, of course, want to engage in the meaningful government-to-government consultation that I referenced earlier, because we take our trust responsibilities seriously. We want to find ways to reach out to the communities that are suffering. The toll that this will take on individual families all across the country is quite serious, and so we are interested in finding ways to really to identify solutions and talk with people to see how we can work through these difficult issues.
And then another, I want to thank you and of course the Secretary for reaching out over a couple of weekends ago in your personal time to both of you for trying to help us through the situation in the Klamath, and we deeply appreciate your interest in that extraordinarily challenging situation. In your opinion, though, in the allocation decision that's being made in that basin, the choice has been kind of focused, I hate to say on a single species because that's not quite right. It would appear that the focus is on one species that's in the lake and another species that's along the stream below the lake, the stream being the Klamath. And so this makes it extraordinarily difficult, the way our federal laws are set up, to balance. It's more like a single species approach as opposed to a community approach. Are you going to suggest at some point that we do something in the federal law area to try to reach a point of balance in these dramatic situations where entire communities are going to be devastated? And I mean that for real. You know this, house wells going dry and people and livelihoods being destroyed, but no balance. Is there something we should be doing with our laws to try to get to a more balanced approach?
Well, thank you for that question. I think what we are striving to do is really take a holistic approach, a basin-wide approach in the Klamath, and a holistic approach in all of the basins that we are trying to manage, particularly this year. I can't separate species from the folks who care very deeply about them. I can't separate the salmon from the tribes who are intrinsically tied to that species. And so statutes like the Endangered Species Act help us to manage from a holistic basis and ensure that we are meeting our trust obligations.
I thank you for that. And just, Mr. Chair, just a last remark. It would be worthwhile, I think, for us in knowing that we're making these tough allocation decisions that we call out the cost to all of us of the decisions. It's awfully easy to wander off into the wrong approach when it comes to identifying who's paying how much. So anyway, with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Well, I thank the ranking member, and let me agree with you in your point about how waiting for the courts to sort all this out is not a good solution. If you can get a court ruling in 2 years, you're a much better water lawyer than me. I would add a 0 to that number based on my experience with California water litigation. But with that, I will go to Southern California and recognize Mr. Levin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Incredibly important and timely hearing. Appreciate it very much. Wanted to focus for just a minute on desalination. Bureau of Reclamation's helped fund desalination projects in my district, including the Mission Basin Groundwater Purification Facility, which provides 15% of the city of Oceanside's water supply, and the Doheny Ocean Desalination Project, which will produce new, local, drought-proof water supplies once built. Ms. Klein, I wanted to turn to you. Do you agree that projects like these, which enhance local water supplies and provide other federal benefits, are a good investment for the federal government?
I think absolutely the types of projects you're noting, they are among the tools that we have, and certainly when we can identify and support projects that have community support and address the drought impacts and create more resilient communities. That's something that we are interested in doing.
And I know that the American Jobs Plan from President Biden recognizes the Western drought crisis and the need to maximize the resilience of our land, maximize the resilience of our water resources as well. And I really think we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity here to invest in solutions that will actually meet the challenges before us, whether they be economic or environmental or infrastructure. So we're very hopeful that we'll get that across the finish line. Ms. Klein, I wanted to ask you, how do you think the American Jobs Plan can make the West better prepared for drought conditions like those we're experiencing today?
Thank you for that question. The American Jobs Plan, it really is, as you say, a once-in-a-generation opportunity. It's a time for us to invest in making communities more resilient, to ensuring that communities that perhaps have not had the benefit of these types of investments in the past, making sure that we are looking to provide adequate water supply, make sure that tribal communities, for instance, have access to clean water. It is really an opportunity to make the type of significant investments that are necessary for creating a more drought-resilient nation.
And do you think desalination projects should be part of that portfolio of strategies pursued in the American Jobs Plan to respond to the current drought and to prepare for future droughts?
I think, again, any opportunity we have to support projects that have community support, that have a goal of creating more drought-resilient communities, are something that we are interested in working on and working with all of our tribal and state partners and communities across the West to really make sure that we're investing in a whole suite of tools.
Thank you, Ms. Klein. Mr. Chairman, I'll have more questions for some of our second panelists. In particular, we've got one from Orange County. That's nice to see, and appreciate again you holding the hearing. Incredibly important issues for us in California, and I'll yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Levin. I am told that next up is Mr. Case from Hawaii. The chair now recognizes Mr. Case for 5 minutes. Except I don't see Mr. Case. Let me see who I've got next in the batting order. I do see Congresswoman Doris Matsui from the great Sacramento River region of California, and a great water leader in her own right. So let's go to you, Doris, if you're ready.
All right. It's a bit of a surprise. I was trying to do something else, but I'm great here. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is really a very, very important subcommittee hearing, and especially since I'm from the great state of California, and we've had these challenges in the past, particularly because now the intensified wildfires and severe droughts and the flooding in California, and also flooding in my district of Sacramento, require innovative climate adaptation ideas. Now, I've been working with the city and regional water authority on the Sacramento Water Bank, which will increase the region's water storage and recovery capacities by more than 50%. And I recently helped secure nearly $900,000 to begin its groundwater modeling. Similarly, the Sacramento Area Flood Control Agency is looking at creative ways to increase capacity for flood protection while providing water for groundwater recharge and improving aquatic habitats. But groundwater storage is not just an option in Sacramento and the American River watershed region. In California, there's approximately 850 million acre-feet of groundwater storage available. Ms. Klein and Mr. Esquivel, how will the expansion of groundwater storage improve conditions for water supply and the environment, especially in light of the challenges of climate change?
Ms. Klein, would you like to take it first, or I can go?
Sure, I'm happy to go first. Thank you very much for that question. I think, as you mentioned, climate change is certainly something that is touching every part of what we do, and we want to work with the types of local and state water managers that you mentioned to make sure that we are really investing in the appropriate science to understand what is happening to our resources, how we can tap into greater water supply potentially. The impacts of this drought on groundwater supply is something that we are very concerned about and want to work with states like California to make sure that the federal government is supporting states in any way we can to make sure that we are both protecting groundwater supply, but also potentially making it available where we can. So,
and Mr. Escobar, if you would add your comments to this.
Yeah, thank you. I think what continues to be the reality is that we have water systems for a 20th century and we're in a 21st century climate. And that means we're going to have a reduced snowpack, as we saw, with it's less dependable for our reservoirs. And really, we have to be thinking about the movement of water from our headwaters to the oceans, but importantly, below our ground. Our groundwater storage is our most critical and long-term storage that we can have. It far exceeds our surface storage capacity, but it's actually that interaction between surface storage and groundwater and the better understanding of the hydrology of our state that is really going to get us to these next generation projects in the 21st century. So groundwater will continue to be very important.
Certainly. And I also want to ask you about lessons learned from our previous droughts in California, particularly as it relates to preserving our important salmon runs. Salmon runs are devastated during previous drought periods, especially by high water temperatures and reduced water flow. What is the State Water Resources Control Board doing to avoid the mistakes of previous droughts and ensure that salmon mortality levels are not as high as they've been during previous drought periods?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I think the reality is when things get this dry, it becomes very hard to maintain temperature management, and we certainly saw that in the last drought. What we have some benefit of is we've been working these last weeks hand in hand with the federal agencies using supercomputers from National NOAA's Marine Fisheries Service and being able to at least assess different scenarios and working with the operators to see what balance we could at least bring within the system and try to keep up a little more water back in the reservoirs for the temperature benefits. But more importantly, if it's dry next year, it is going to be so critical. Right now, it is the wettest it will be, certainly through the end of this summer. And if it continues to be dry, we'll be in catastrophic circumstances next winter. And keeping as much as we can in our reservoirs is just really critical.
Okay, and I know we don't have much time, but Ms. Klein, how is the Interior Department responding to the climate impacts that we're already seeing now, while also preparing for the climate impacts that we know are coming in the medium and long term?
So one of the first things that Secretary Haaland did after arriving was to charge all of us in the department to work together through a department climate task force to identify the type of climate science that we need to get to our land and water managers to make informed decisions. And we really are keenly interested in making the types of investments that will help us get to that 21st century infrastructure that Mr. Escobar referred to.
Certainly, I've run out of time already, but certainly we'd like to work with you as we move forward on this. Thanks a lot, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlelady. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Long Beach, where they may not get a lot of rainfall, but they have managed their water very innovatively and with a forward-looking spirit and are probably better positioned heading into another critical drought year than many Northern California communities. So welcome, Alan Lowenthal. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for having this exciting, kind of very timely panel on the status of the drought conditions throughout the Western United States. And I'm going to talk about those local efforts in the second panel, not so much the first panel. But thank you. Remind me when it comes to my turn in the second panel to talk about what we're doing here. But I'm concerned about one issue, which to many people seem like a very small issue, but to me, it's a very large issue. California is an arid climate. Much of it is desert. We're accustomed to drought conditions, but we know with climate change, They're becoming more serious, more frequent, more severe. The last drought that we had was very severe. But what I'm most interested in it is that some communities were disproportionately impacted by that, and I want to talk about that disproportionate impact. So, for example, Catalina Island is in my district. It's one of those communities which faced a very heavy burden going through this last drought. Having insufficient access to fresh water, totally dependent upon tourism. All the restaurants and the hotels had to ship their dishes, their dirty dishes, and their linens to be washed in the mainland. So they had to ship them off the island because there was no water. Residents are now, had happened for a while, forced to flush their toilets with salt water, meaning that those pipes don't last as long. They have real serious environmental problems with that. And they have an old aging desalination plant that they just can't rely on. So we're now at the beginning of another drought. I'd like to ask Mr. Estebel, thinking that this could be worse than the last drought, could you kind of share with me, first of all, what lessons has the Water Board learned from the impacts of the last drought on water supplies, and how is the state planning on implementing changes this time around for underserved and isolated communities? That's what I'm interested. What have we learned, like Catalina Island? Maybe, we've heard generally what we're going to do. I want to know what we're going to do for the underserved and the isolated.
Thank you so much, Congressman, for your focus and your question there. What happened in the last drought was a real recognition, I think, of communities' vulnerability to drought. We saw over 3,000 wells go dry in the Central Valley. But to your point, even in Santa Barbara or Catalina Island, up and down the state, we saw communities really struggle with water and water availability. I think we put in somewhere around 22 building moratoriums in communities because of a lack of access to water. So we've been working with those communities from the last drought in ensuring that they had available supplies. And importantly, we have emergency programs like a haul and truck water program that's already, and it is now long-term. We had to really spool up a lot of those programs in an emergency fashion, and it really led to the passage of the Safe and Affordable Fund. And there we have a more flexible tool to address not just drought, but the many challenges, the more than 300 water systems, a million Californians that don't have access to clean water. That nexus between drought, water quality and drought is really strong. And again, we have so much more data to be active, not wait for communities to fail, but really get to them first. But we also saw where oftentimes just a day or two heads up notice when a community would start to suck sand into their pumps. And we need to, and so there we have orders already going out to systems that we know or consider to be vulnerable in order to just assess what their conditions are. And some communities that already have day zero, meaning they can identify when they may run out of water, particularly in the Russian River watershed and some other hotspots. So we have dollars and we have data.
I compliment you on what you're doing there. I think that's wonderful. But I'm talking about an island that can't use trucking in of water. I'm talking about an island that uses salt water for their bathrooms. I'm talking about an island that can't even wash anything, has to ship it to the mainland. And that's under the best of conditions. And they have a rickety old desal plant. They're the only community their water system is run by a utility that provides electricity, doesn't provide water. It's a crisis even under the best of circumstances. So I'd like to follow up and figure out how we're going to work on this issue, because this is not a short-term fix. It's exacerbated during a drought tremendously, but it's lost out there as an island. It doesn't really have the access to other Santa Barbara and others where they can move things around. You can't move things around when you're on an island like this. And so I would like to follow up with you on that.
Let's definitely.
And the only other part of the question is, you talked about, maybe you've already described it, but the $5.1 billion drought and the infrastructure package that the governor, very, very exciting. And that's going to help communities respond to the drought. as this goes along, do you have anything specifically to tell us at the federal government what we can do to complement this or to support this effort specifically?
Very quickly, if you could, Mr. Esquivel.
Yeah, I'll keep it very brief. I'll just say that we recently completed a needs analysis for our smallest systems to figure out what it would take in the next 5 years to really get them to a place of resiliency. We found a funding gap of about $5 billion in there. We have $1.3 billion that's going to wastewater and drinking water to really make a down payment on that. But I think additional dollars and in translating them into projects.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Terrific. I thank the gentleman. And Mr. Lowenthal, I'd like to talk to you offline about Catalina. I have an idea that might be a really good fit for what your community is going to go through in the months ahead.
I appreciate that, and I certainly will.
Terrific. I think the only other member I see is Mr. Soto, so he may be our final member to recognize for this panel. You're recognized for 5 minutes, Mr. Soto.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we're here talking about a very important issue, the status of drought conditions throughout the Western United States. We know how key the American Jobs Plan will be to help with that challenge. We also, in the eastern states, have drought conditions and challenges as well, and growth challenges. My district, our region, grew over 20% it's in the last 10 years, and I represent over 930,000 constituents, more than most members of Congress. So we know our Floridan aquifer is really starting to get tapped out, and it's affecting our springs and our lakes, which also affects wildlife and our quality of life in Central Florida. Certain areas like Tampa Bay have put forward desalinization plans, but those haven't been ideal, as now finally utilizing surface water. It's swamp water, so it does take a lot of processing to make sure it's healthy. And we've had some victories already through the Water Resource Development Act, being able to convert some of our flood control water bodies to now reservoirs like Taylor Creek in Osceola County. But not all of our communities are that fortunate. In Polk County, we just lost a $400 million jobs project because we didn't have enough water. It is it's hurting our infrastructure more resilient to the effects of climate change. When it comes to water management, Central Florida communities must be both resilient to drought and deal with water quality concerns like harmful algae blooms that are increasingly common under warmer temperatures, all while contending with increasing demands for the Florida and aquifer that I discussed. How can the American Jobs Plan make Central Florida communities like mine more resilient to drought and climate change impacts?
Thank you so much for the question, Congressman Soto. The American Jobs Plan really does represent a tremendous opportunity to make investments in the type of science we need to better understand what changing climate will bring to places like Florida and all across the country. It's not just drought that we need to keep our eye on, certainly. We've talked about fire today, and also you bring up population changes, which can certainly stress existing infrastructure. So the investments we want to make in science will help us better understand and manage the resources. And we also want to invest in the types of water reuse and recycling programs that can certainly benefit communities all across the country, not just in the West. So we're certainly eager to work with you to see how we can make that a reality.
Thank you, Ms. Klein. And the American Jobs Plan also invests in the modernization of our water systems. Does the plan include a role for federal support of innovative water technologies like real-time monitoring and leak detection?
Absolutely. That's the exact type of investment in science that we are hoping to make. I'm committed to stealing my colleague, Mr. Esquivel's phrase about developing 21st century modern technologies, when we are working with 20th century infrastructure in some cases. And so we want to make the types of investments to help managers on the ground make better decisions on a day-to-day basis on how they use and move water and ensure that there is access to quality water for communities all across the country.
Thank you. And Chairman, we often talk about in this committee and in natural resources, along with energy and commerce, the sort of twin efforts to work on these issues. You'll be happy to know we're working on the quality and clean water issue in that committee today, as we're working on the supply and how it works with our natural resources in this committee. So it's great to see between those two committees with so much overlap in the membership, us taking on these issues together in the American Jobs Plan to make sure we're going to have a 21st century water system that has both ample supply and clean water. And with that, thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Well, thank you, Mr. Soto, and it's a great point. We have carved up jurisdiction on water in interesting ways among committees and among federal agencies, and it's really important that we have that interaction and that collaboration. And Ms. Klein, I seized on the greatness of Chair Esquivel's phrase as well. I am going to continue to use that 20th century infrastructure trying to meet 21st century challenges. That is a winner. But with that, let me thank this panel. I know that Ranking Member Benz has expressed a desire to ask some more questions that might arise from the next panel. So if any members of this panel are willing and able, as a courtesy, to continue to stay with us, that would be great. Otherwise, if you got to go, we understand that, and we will submit questions in writing. So thanks so much for the first panel. And we'll now move to the second panel. After your testimony, for the panelists about to join us, after your testimony is complete, please do remember to mute yourself to avoid inadvertent background noise. And again, I'll allow all the witnesses to testify before we bring it back to members. For the second panel, we will hear first.
And his last name is...
So there you go, as if on cue, as I reminded people to mute themselves. Thank you for that example. For the second panel, we're going to hear first from Mr. Ensminger, who's the General Manager of Southern Nevada Water Authority. Then we will hear from Dan Keppen, Executive Director of the Family Farm Alliance. Ranking Member Bentz provided some introductory remarks about Mr. Keppen earlier. And then next, I will invite my colleague, Mr. Lowenthal, to introduce a witness from Orange County. And then we will invite Mr. Costa to introduce our final witness from the San Joaquin Valley. So the chair now recognizes Mr. Ensminger.
Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member Benz, and members of the subcommittee, my name is John Ensminger. I'm the General Manager of the Southern Nevada Water Authority. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My comments will focus on the Colorado River. Most of the basin is in extreme or exceptional drought. Forecasted inflows this year are just 32% of average, the second worst year since record keeping began in 1906. 15 of the last 20 years have been dry, and Lake Mead is at 37% capacity, and Lake Powell is at 34% capacity. Looking out just a few years, if the same hydrology levels that we've experienced recently continue, there's a high probability that Lake Mead water levels will continue to decline, potentially reaching an elevation within the next decade where we will hover just above the point where Hoover Dam can no longer deliver water downstream and power production will come to a halt. While Colorado River water users have invested billions of dollars to reduce consumption and increase resiliency, the situation we face today is real and urgent. Current conditions require us to take bold and unprecedented steps to conserve and stretch our existing water supplies. The security of 7 states, 2 countries, and 40 million people depend on us to plan and act, not to wait and see. The Southern Nevada community depends on the Colorado River for nearly all of its municipal water supply. Our community, comprised of more than 2.2 million people and representing more than 70% of our state's total population, has invested billions of dollars in local funds in infrastructure projects and conservation initiatives to ensure that we continue to reuse nearly every drop of water used indoors. In aggregate, these measures have resulted in a 23% decrease in Nevada's consumption of Colorado River water since 2002, during which time our population has increased by over 52%. However, We recognize that now is no time to rest on our laurels and are pleased to report that the Nevada legislature will soon pass Assembly Bill 356, which will ban the use of Colorado River water for irrigating non-functional turf in the greater Las Vegas Valley by the year 2025. Current conditions require us to take action to stretch our existing supplies. The Bureau of Reclamation's 2012 Colorado River Water Supply and Demand Study identified water reuse as a long-term augmentation option for the Colorado River, with the potential to yield up to 800,000 acre-feet per year. One example of turning what that study envisioned into reality is Southern Nevada's collaboration with the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California on the development of a regional recycled water project. While this project is still in the planning and testing stage, once built, it can provide up to 150 million gallons of water a day. The project will take wastewater and purify it using innovative treatment processes and use the purified wastewater to replenish groundwater basins in Southern California. This new locally produced water supply will provide Metropolitan with more than 100,000 acre-feet of water per year. Under the proposed partnership, the Southern Nevada would invest in the project in exchange for a portion of Metropolitan's Colorado River water remaining in Lake Mead. This first of its kind interstate exchange of water would enhance Metropolitan's available supplies while simultaneously providing benefits to the residents of Southern Nevada and the Colorado River Basin as a whole. However, this project will take about 11 years to design and construct at a cost of more than $3 billion, which underscores the urgency of acting now because even great innovations take time to implement. While Title 16 provides Reclamation with the authority to identify and fund recycling opportunities, this program was not designed or funded to facilitate recycling projects on a scale necessary to meaningfully address the daunting challenges now facing the Colorado River. Given the scale of the challenge before us, the need for significant federal funding to advance regional recycling efforts is obvious, and I urge your support for legislation for this purpose. The Colorado River Basin is at a crossroads that requires a focused and robust approach to federal investment in measures that will mitigate and respond to the effects of climate change. These measures must include investment in forest and watershed health, water conservation and recycling, and agricultural infrastructure and operations if we are to continue to ensure a thriving economy and environment. The reality we knew was coming has arrived. From my corner of the world, there seems to be no more time to waste. Thank you for your time. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. I will now recognize Dan Keppen for 5 minutes. Welcome, sir.
Good afternoon, Chairman Huffman and Ranking Member Bentz, Chairman Grijalva and Ranking Member Westerman and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate this opportunity to discuss the growing drought catastrophe we're witnessing across the West. My organization represents family farmers, ranchers, irrigation districts, and allied industries in 16 Western states. The American food consumer nationwide has access to fruits, vegetables, nuts, grains, and meat products throughout the year. That's largely because of Western producers and the projects that provide water to them. I'm proud to work for an organization that represents Western farmers and ranchers. Agriculture is the only U.S. sector that has posted a trade surplus for well over 50 years. As diets evolve and the global population continues to grow, our position as the world's largest food exporter will play an even greater role in the world economy. Maintaining food independence is more than just providing a healthy, abundant, and transparent food supply. It's also a matter of national security. I've also been asked today to advance the concerns and recommendations of the Klamath Water Users Association, a longtime member of the Family Farm Alliance, and it's an organization I worked for from 2001 to 2005. I'm testifying to you today from Klamath Falls, Oregon. Earlier this month, the Bureau of Reclamation announced that no water would be diverted at the Klamath Project's A Canal for irrigation in 2021. The reason is a combination of drought and regulatory restrictions under the Endangered Species Act. This year, close to 1 million acre-feet of water will be available for use by suckers and salmon protected by the ESA. For the first time since its construction in 1907, there will be zero water available from the A Canal for irrigation or wildlife refuge purposes. The drought's going to be tough for everybody up and down the Klamath River, for tribal communities, and for commercial fishing interests. It's going to be especially hard on family farmers served by the Klamath Project and represented by Klamath water users. They'll be going without stored water in a project where that water was originally developed for irrigation. Now that water has been reallocated for 3 species of fish. We have yet to see scientific correlations showing how those fish have benefited after 20 years of this type of management. Worse, it's taking water away from over 400 other species that rely upon water in canals and ditches, farmers' fields, and 2 critically important national wildlife refuges. This current single species focus is not fair, and it's not worked for farms, fish, or waterfowl. For long-term stability, a basin-wide settlement agreement is needed that addresses water management for irrigation and fish and provides a fair and legal treatment of the Klamath Project irrigators and their families. It can be done. It's been done elsewhere. We can do better for farmers, tribes, and fish in the Klamath Basin, and we need to do it now. In the larger picture, this year is shaping up to be one of the worst in recent Western history, which I detail further in my written testimony. The current drought crisis underscores some key concerns. First, water infrastructure is needed to protect future water supply reliability. As I've noted in earlier testimony before the subcommittee, a national coalition of over 200 organizations urged Congress last January to include Western water infrastructure provisions in any potential infrastructure or economic recovery package. We need to authorize and fund federal programs to partner on new federal and non-federal water storage and groundwater recharge projects. This includes extending provisions in the WIN Act of 2016. Funding must also be provided to the Aging Bureau Reclamation Infrastructure Account created last December, amongst other things. Second, water management in the West is becoming too inflexible. We need a new way of looking at how we manage our limited water resources. We need a broader view of how water is used, one that considers population growth, food production, and habitat needs. Third, fierce Western wildfire disasters are becoming an annual occurrence. This underscores the importance of improving on-the-ground management actions that can lead to improved forest health, which benefits every Western watershed. Finally, now is the time for collaboration, not confrontation. Ag producers, tribal, and conservation groups need to come together. If we don't, the public policies and resource management strategies that we need to maintain a viable and sustainable rural West will be impossible to achieve. Perhaps the only silver lining is that this crisis will hopefully draw more public and political attention. This could lead to needed, reasonable policies that support farmers and investment in rural communities, including water infrastructure. In the short term, we recommend a fast-track response capability from the USDA and Interior Department that enables a localized response by farmers and ranchers. This unprecedented West-wide drought requires a level of reaction that is immediate and sustainable. We look forward to working with you to address these pressing issues. Thanks for this opportunity to present this testimony today.
Thank you, Mr. Keppen. The chair will now turn to Congressman Lowenthal to introduce our next witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Mr. Michael Marcus. I'm going to follow up on how we left the last panel one talking about some of the innovative things that are going on in Southern California. Mike's a friend. He's been a mentor to me. He is, as you know, it's the 14th year as the general manager of the Orange County Water District, which manages the Orange County groundwater basin, supplying water to over 2.5 million residents in Orange County, much of it also in my district. And about 13 years ago, just to kind of fill you in, Mike oversaw a partnership between the Water District, which he is the general manager, and also the Sanitation District to design and construct the groundwater replenishment system, which is a locally controlled source of water. Today it houses the world's, not just the world's largest water reuse plant, currently producing in excess of 100 million gallons a day, going up to 130 million hopefully this year. And Mike is just well known throughout the country. He serves on many boards of directors, Water Research Foundation, National Water Research Institute, American Water Works Association, California section of the Water Reuse Association. Mike Marcus, you are a great leader. Welcome to our committee.
Well, thank you very much, Congressman, for the very generous introduction. I think you just gave my testimony, but I'll testify nonetheless. Good afternoon, Chairman Huffman, Ranking Member Bentz, and members of the subcommittee. On behalf of the Orange County Water District's Board of Directors, we thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Orange County, California is a semi-arid region that receives about 13 inches of annual rainfall. OCWD manages a groundwater basin that provides 77% of the water supply for nearly 2.5 million people. This requires OCWD to use a portfolio approach that doesn't rely too heavily on any single source of water to provide a reliable and secure water supply. OCWD has successfully leveraged federal water infrastructure assistance to support this approach, which includes operating the world's largest and most advanced water recycling facility, the Groundwater Replenishment System, or GWRS, capturing and storing stormwater flows to increase supply, and considering supplemental supply through ocean desalination. OCWD has proven that it has used and leveraged federal support to develop water supplies that are resilient to climate change impacts and unreliable precipitation patterns. Congress should consider providing robust federal support for a portfolio of Western water supply programs. Any water infrastructure policy should include water recycling. Water recycling delivers a locally developed and reliable water supply that reduces demands on imported water from Northern California and the Colorado River. In 2008, OCWD began operating the 70 million gallon per day groundwater replenishment system with its partner agency, the Orange County Sanitation District. The project was expanded to 100 million gallons per day in 2015 and is currently undergoing a final expansion that will provide 130 million gallons per day by early 2023, which is enough water for 1 million people. GWRS was possible because of a $20 million grant under Title 16, $440 million from US EPA's State Revolving Fund Loan Program, and a $135 million WIFIA loan. The benefits from this federal support is it gives a blueprint for advanced water recycling that can be duplicated throughout the country. It creates a new water supply, lessens reliance on imported water, reduces the cost of water, and provides a resilient and reliable supply of water. Storage. We believe that increased capture and storage of stormwater flows must be a drought response option. OCWD and Dr. Marty Ralph of the Scripps School of Oceanography at UC San Diego are working on predictive tools that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers can rely upon to store stormwater at dams without jeopardizing public safety, a method known as Forecast-Informed Reservoir Operations, or FIRO, which has been successfully implemented at Lake Mendocino in Northern California. FIRO allows dam operators to be more precise in predicting the impacts of wintertime storms to prevent the unnecessary release and wasting of water supplies. Chairman Huffman's Future Act enhances FIRO use and benefits. It directs the Corps to update water control manuals using improved forecasting tools. OCWD has also entered into a landmark agreement with the Corps to increase stormwater capture behind Prado Dam to augment its local water supply. Desalination. Desalination of coastal and inland water can help mitigate drought conditions. We see the investment benefits in San Diego and in Israel. Our board of directors is currently exploring and evaluating a seawater desalination project in Huntington Beach. As the city of Carlsbad desalination plant successfully illustrates, solutions can be developed to protect ratepayers and the environment. Desalination project funding, assistance, and investment in research and technology to help address the concerns are vital. Representative Levin's desalination legislation that has been incorporated into the Future Act addresses this, and we support its provisions. Infrastructure project assistance. We urge that the water infrastructure assistance should provide assistance to projects that deliver cost-effective and value-driven benefits on a regional basis that address the water needs for the greatest amount of people. Today, as in many areas in California, are suffering from water shortages. OCWD's service area is in a much better condition due, in large part, to our participation in available federal programs. We look forward to working with you as the next generation of federal Western water supply policies are developed. I would also like to extend an invitation to the subcommittee to visit OCWD and learn how we continue to advance the technology and science of innovative water supply solutions. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Marcus. The chair now recognizes Mr. Costa to introduce the final witness in this panel.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and appreciate the opportunity to introduce Tom Collinshaw, who I've worked with for many years. And I want to thank all the witnesses for talking about all the challenges we face and the water tools in our water toolbox. Tom Collinshaw is the president and CEO of Self-Help Enterprises based in California. Many of you, I suspect, have worked with Self-Help Enterprises in your own communities. They have a long positive reputation of really making home ownership through the sweat equity concept a reality for low-income families. Among the many projects that they are currently working on to help 85 disadvantaged communities up and down the valley to develop safe drinking water projects. Many of these communities are not incorporated and are small and don't have the wherewithal to put together a water project and or to update an antiquated system such as we have in Dos Palos or Gustin. Drought impacts are felt throughout the West, but when the water is scarce, we know water quality suffers, and in many cases, wells go dry, and many of these people are dependent upon a water well, sadly. Tom and his staff know firsthand the impacts that droughts have on people. We've known and worked with each other for many years, and the good work that they do is felt by thousands throughout the valley, not only for home ownership, but improving water supply for these kinds of communities. I would urge you all to listen carefully to Tom's testimony. I think it can be helpful to communities throughout our country. Tom Collinsworth, please.
Thank you so much, Congressman Costa, for that generous introduction. Self-Help Enterprises has worked since 1965 to build nearly 9,000 affordable homes for low-income families, and also to bolster communities by building sustainable infrastructure. We have observed firsthand the impacts of climate change and the infamous California water wars on the most vulnerable people in our state. The San Joaquin Valley is blessed with great natural resources. Sediments from annual flooding cycles have created some of the most fertile soils in the world. Snowfall in the Sierras has historically provided a natural, reliable reservoir, slowly melting each spring to feed the valley's rivers and farms. The valley's precipitation falls almost entirely in the winter months between November and March. Much of the San Joaquin Valley is technically a desert, receiving less than 10 inches of rainfall per year. Because of this, storing water for use during the hot summer growing season is essential. Water is stored primarily in snowpack, constructed reservoirs, and in underground aquifers. Irrigation is the lifeblood of Central Valley farmers. So much so that 17% of the nation's irrigated land is here in the Central Valley. That land produces a quarter of the nation's food. So when rain, snow, and reservoirs fail to deliver surface water for irrigation, it's a serious thing, and the groundwater becomes Plan B. When the rivers run dry and surface water allocations are paltry, farmers fire up their wells and begin pumping groundwater. Of course, people live here too, lots of them. San Joaquin Valley is home to about 4 million people, but those people are dispersed over about 27,000 square miles. Remote rural towns dot the landscape, and tens of thousands live on homesteads where their water supply comes from a single private well. Throughout California, 85% of residents rely on groundwater for at least part of their water supply. In the last drought, we saw desperation and misery. Farmers and ranchers, desperate to keep their crops and livestock alive, turned to groundwater wells. Intensive, high-powered pumping by big agricultural wells inevitably causes the water table to drop. One by one, nearby wells dry up. The wells that serve the small towns and rural households are always smaller and shallower than these large commercial scale wells. Try to imagine the misery of a family whose water supply is just gone. No water to sustain the family's health, no water to bathe, no water to flush a toilet. A home without water supply becomes valueless. So a homeowner with a failed well cannot even borrow money against their property to drill a new well. When a well serving an entire community fails, we multiply that misery by the number of families relying on that well. There are programs to help families who find themselves in this crisis. Self-Help Enterprises has worked to deploy state and federal resources to achieve interim and permanent solutions. During the last drought, we developed an emergency response program, an expensive system of temporary water tanks, small pumps, and water hauled by trucks. It keeps families in their homes with a semblance of normalcy until a permanent solution can be achieved. We have 324 of these tanks currently deployed across the valley, with more being requested every single day. To resolve water outages permanently, a number of strategies are used and the solutions are varied. Sometimes a new water well can be drilled, and sometimes a connection to a nearby water system is an available option. We are gratified to know that federal agencies under your purview want to lend a hand. There are a number of ways the Bureau of Reclamation can have a positive impact on the groundwater crisis in California. Increased funding to water smart and small scale water efficiency grants, funding irrigation efficiencies and water recycling could leave more water in the ground and support the implementation of California's Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. The federal government could incentivize and fund groundwater storage opportunities as a complement to surface water storage. Keeping the aquifers full ensures the reliability of wells, prevents land subsidence, and keeps the storage banks full for a non-rainy day. Groundwater storage potential is larger than any reservoir we could ever build. The combined storage capacity of the state's major reservoirs is about 50 million acre feet. The groundwater storage is estimated to be at least 850 million acre feet. USDA and EPA have other programs that support emergency response, and they deserve funding as well. It's already too late to avoid this drought. Emergency funding, interim measures, and rapid response will be required to get us through. But we need better preparedness for future drought, and reducing groundwater demands is one key strategy. Increasing the groundwater storage is another. As California works to achieve a sustainable balance in its groundwater resources, federal support for water efficiency, enhanced water storage, and water recycling will help us stretch every drop. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Colshaw. We will now bring it back to the members for questions, and I'll start by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Starting with Mr. Ensminger, I was excited hearing you describe this really ambitious water recycling project that you're undertaking in collaboration with partners from Southern California. It seems obvious to me that this is something that can bolster your water supply security and protect the communities you serve against future droughts, which are likely to be the new normal. The only piece that I didn't like was hearing that it's going to take 11 years to do it. So let me ask, is there anything we can do to shorten that time frame? And also, let me ask you, this will be a compound question, I apologize. So I'm interested in speeding projects like yours along. I'm also interested in the limitations that exist in current law that prevent the Bureau of Reclamation from participating in a large-scale recycling project like you are undertaking to the same degree they could participate in, let's say, a massive surface storage project. There are hard limits on how far they can go with you on recycling. There are much more generous rules that apply to other projects. If you could just speak to those two things, please.
Happy to do so, Chairman Huffman. I'll take the second one first. The most logical answer to the second one is the $20 million cap on funding under Title 16. And as you said, you don't really see restrictions or caps anywhere near that low in other types of projects that the Bureau of Reclamation can participate in. So be it either through that vehicle or a new vehicle, substantially increasing the ability of the Bureau of Reclamation to partner with water users in the Colorado River Basin and throughout the Western United States on these sort of large-scale regional projects, I think is imperative. To your second question, I wish I could address it a little more specifically, but being a Nevadan, I'm not as familiar with some of the regulatory requirements in the state of California. So it's probably best if I ask our partners in Metropolitan to reply to how much that 11-year time frame could be shortened up in writing, if that's okay.
Yeah, I would love to hear more about that, and thank you very much. Mr. Marcus, I've got to say, you just checked every box that I have when it comes to good water management. You talked about a diverse water supply portfolio. It is increasingly comprised of sources that are highly resilient, that'll be there for you in critical drought years. Wet water is what we care about, not paper water. And reducing your reliance on imported water supplies, which are going to become more subject to disruption in years ahead. So I commend you for your innovation and the breadth of your innovation in particular. Talk about how your investment in water recycling and this diverse, locally controlled portfolio positions you better heading into cycles of critical drought years like this summer than maybe some of your neighbors who continue to rely predominantly on imported water supplies.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I think one of the key benefits, now that we've been operating our facility for 13 years, is we're able to rely on this water as a source of supply for our groundwater basin. And as a result, we've actually been able to maintain higher groundwater elevations in the basin. So we've been able to increase those water levels during wet and even slightly during dry conditions. I think with reduced water demands, there's not quite as much pumping out of the basin. So having this 103,000 acre feet a year supply that we're able to put into the basin really does help drought-proof us. As an example, we've had an extraordinarily dry year. I think, as has been mentioned, we've only received, I think, 5 3/4 inches of rain, and that's all we're going to get for this water year. And we'll probably only see about a 20 to 30,000 acre feet overdraft in the basin. So even with extreme dry conditions, the amount of overdraft isn't as significant as it otherwise might be.
Terrific. And thanks very much for the shout out for forecast-informed reservoir operations, something we've both been working on. And just it makes too much sense to not incorporate that permanently into Army Corps operation manuals. So appreciate that. And with that, I will yield and recognize Ranking Member Benz, if he's with us. And if he is not, I do see Congresswoman Gonzalez-Colon as next up on, there's Ranking Member Benz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, I have a question. I think we still have Ms. Cordalis with us. And the question is this. You mentioned that the tribes wanted to be included in any relief package. Do the tribes have a number, an amount that they would be asking be included in such a package? I know you mentioned both the tribe and also the fishermen. Is there a number?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. I appreciate that. I would be happy to submit that number to your office or to the record after this.
Thank you for that, and I look forward to receiving that. Since we have initiated a bill, Congressman LaMalfa and I, asking for relief, and we have a certain amount of money in that bill allocated to tribal interests, but I have no idea if you were talking with him on that or not. And so we want to make sure you're included.
Well, thank you, Congressman, and we look forward to engaging your office and also to working on long-term solutions to the Klamath Basin issues. We certainly have a long history of working with our neighbors in this basin, and we're ready to do that again. We're ready to work on satisfying the UROC's water right, but also finding long-term solutions. So I'm pleased you're here today and your interest in talking about the Klamath. I'm pleased Dan Keppen is here also. And I think we've got a lot of synergy to find solutions. Thank you.
Thank you. And speaking of Mr. Keppen, I have a question for him. Mr. Keppen, last week I chaired a Republican forum on water in which we heard from a range of Western stakeholders on the impact drought's having on communities and industries. It was clear to me that while we've done some work, the WIN Act being a primary example, we still have more to do to help the drought-proof, if you will, the West. Many of the solutions proposed included improving the regulatory process at the federal level. Many of my constituents are suffering through what they view, and many of us view, as the kind of single focus of the ESA without balance, perhaps. Your testimony mentions that water management in the West is becoming increasingly inflexible. Can you share with us some examples of that inflexibility?
Well, I would say in general, we need to find ways to incentivize landowners to make the ESA, for example, work. That's far more preferable than what we've been seeing in recent years, where, ESA has been used by special interest environmental groups and federal agencies in court as a means of, protecting only a single species. So examples of that would include the Central Valley Project in California, where water that once served agriculture is now kept in reserve behind Shasta Dam for temperature requirements intended to protect salmon in the Sacramento River. Outflows are controlled by, flows intended to benefit Delta smelt down in the Sacramento San Joaquin River Delta in California. And as I mentioned in my testimony, we have a similar situation in Klamath. You have water being held back to meet the lake level elevations for suckers that are listed under the Endangered Species Act, while elevated flows are sent downstream intended to benefit coho salmon in the Klamath River in California, down in Amy Cordalis's neighborhood. So also, I guess another example here in Oregon would be in Central Oregon. We've got water intended to benefit spotted frogs that's released in the wintertime, which pulls down the stored water that benefits irrigators and fish species during summer months. So those are some examples. I just think that right now we're not seeing the Endangered Species Act being implemented in a way that really promotes recovery of species. That can only be done by incentivizing private landowners and working with other stakeholders and agencies to help bring these species back through habitat improvements.
Mr. Chair, I'm not sure how much time I have left. Time left for one more minute. One more question. Or am I out of time?
Yes, you do. You got a minute.
Thank you. Well, another question for Mr. Kappan. I asked the assistant to the secretary, Ms. Klein, what forum these incredible challenges might utilize in trying to more effectively get to an answer. And I think you had said, generally speaking, it's time for everybody to sit down and talk. Tell me how you see that actually working.
Well, we almost came up with a long-term solution, and this was probably between 2005 and 2015. It was after I left the Klamath water users, and there were some forums that were set up that allowed stakeholders to get together to sort of air out their differences and come up with a long-range solution. That was done with leadership by the administration in Washington, D.C., which is the Obama administration, and also California and Oregon. Multiple stakeholders were involved, and they ultimately, created a long-term fix that I think would have helped fish and farmers up and down the river. Unfortunately, Congress did not approve that by the end of 2015, so we're sort of back to where we were, 20 years ago, fighting it out in courts. It's going to take a forum like that, people with portfolio that can sort of herd all the cats and air our grievances and reach some solutions.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Benz. And let me just say, I think Dan Keppen spoke some truth just now, and the Ranking Member and I are probably called upon, along with some others, to help make that process, that forum that is so desperately needed, happen very soon. With that, I'll recognize Ms. Napolitano for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a whole slew of questions. I probably will submit them to have them answered in writing. But to Mr. Foss in Idaho, do you have enough funding for taking care of the forest maintenance?
Is Mr. Foss still with us?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for the question. We don't have sufficient funding to double the number of acres treated. Our goal is to double the number of acres treated. How we're achieving that is through using all the resources and all the tools that are available to us.
What would be required? What funding would be required for the federal government to help you achieve that?
I think that approving some of the initiatives that you folks are considering, like the Trillion Trees Act, the Resilient Federal Forests Act, the Treating Tribes and Counties as Good Neighbors Act, and the Rural Forest Markets Act, all would be programs that we would use in partnership with the federal agencies, the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. Those would all provide the resources we need. And the other thing I guess I would say is, even with millions of dollars, if we don't deal with the NEPA litigation issue, we can have all kinds of money, but we can't get the work done on the landscape because those projects are litigated. So it really requires both. And I apologize if that's not specific enough, but that's the reality of the situation we face. And thank you for
Do you mind sending that information to the committee, please?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. To Mr. Esminger, I posed this question before, not realizing that it belonged to the second panel, but I'm talking about the turbines in the Fulwood Dam. I toured it when I was chair of the committee, and it was then that they were installing the turbines at the lower level to be able to create the electricity. Are they still there, and how are they functioning, or will they need to be lowered and put more at a lower elevation?
It is my understanding, and we can certainly have Boulder City augment this answer in writing if necessary, but it's my understanding that the retrofits that they did in Hoover Dam are sufficient to keep power production nearly the same as if when the reservoir is full to where it is now, and continue that power production into the lower elevations of the lake. However, as I mentioned in my testimony, the real concern is if the lake gets closer to dead pool, at which point reclamation can't release water through the dam, then obviously power production goes to zero at that point.
Thank you for the answer. Mr. Keppen of the Farm Alliance, you know, we are trying to find all kinds of ways to create water, but have the farmers increase their amount of reuse of the farm runoff?
Well, thank you, Congresswoman Napolitano, for the question. You know, it kind of depends where you're at. I would say definitely. You know, in California, you have some of the most water efficient, users on the planet in the San Joaquin Valley. Here in the Klamath Basin, we have an incredible project that when there's water in it, water is recirculated and reused sometimes 7 times. You know, one drop of water can be reused 7 times. So it depends on sort of where you're at in the country.
Well, Mother Nature didn't give us any new water. We have to reuse, recycle, and clean it and not abuse it as much as we do right now. I have a question for Mr. Marcus. Congratulations on the work that is done in Orange County. I've toured that facility several times, and I think you're doing marvelous. But do you think that the MWD will be able to be successful in getting that $3 billion put together, maybe even with federal help by upping the 20 million cap to be able to provide more water? That plus desal, will that help?
Absolutely, it will help. And I do believe that Metropolitan will be successful in their project. As Mr. Ensminger mentioned, Title 16, the cap on Title 16 grant funding probably has to be looked at, particularly on these larger regional projects, such as the Metropolitan project. And that's not the only project. There's another project being considered by LA Department of Water and Power in the city sanitation for another type of advanced plant for groundwater recharge. So we're looking at a couple very, very large regional projects, and certainly it'll require not only the grant funding, but also the SRF and the WIFIA funding also. And I think if they're able to utilize those tools, they will be successful.
Well, we have LA City has 4 million people. LA County has 12 million. We certainly could use all the help we can get. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the gentlelady, and when we talk about these water reuse and recycling projects and the tremendous amounts of water that can be made available, no one has done more in that space than the gentlelady from Southern California, so I thank her for her leadership. I now recognize Congresswoman Jennifer Gonzalez-Colon for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. And I want to say thank you to all the witnesses from all panels for today's hearing. I would like to yield my time to Ranking Member Cliff Benz.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Is that so ordered, Mr. Chair?
Without objection.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, so I have a question for Mr. Keppen, and it's this. I think he indicated that that the water in the Klamath Lake, about 300,000 acre feet, was stored by virtue of farmers putting together under the Reclamation Act storage facility and then using the water for farming purposes. This year, that stored water for agriculture instead is going to be utilized for the short-nosed suckerfish in the lake and perhaps another species in the lake, and then released over the course of the summer, as I understand it, to benefit downstream flows and downstream interests. Mr. Keppen, do I have that right?
Yes, sir, Ranking Member Benz.
And so the question, I guess, put more directly is, but for agriculture storing up that water, where would that water be right now?
Well, some of it would be flowing downstream naturally, but it's kind of a complicated hydrology question. But prior to the Klamath Project being built, water at this time of year would be naturally flowing into a basin that would fill up, and then the excess water would flow downstream. That water, a lot of it would evaporate, and in fact, our people believe that more water is being evaporated than what our farmers are using on that reclaimed ground now.
So this is not to suggest that the fish don't have an interest in this discussion. They certainly do. The question is, how do we take into account under the Endangered Species Act those who put these systems together and now find themselves on the non-receiving water end of the stick? How do we get there given the nature of the Endangered Species Act?
Well, again, I think we need to come up with some sort of a solution or a long-term settlement agreement that looks at the entire package, all of the factors that are affecting fish, and part of that equation has to be reliable water supplies for irrigators. And right now, I don't see under the existing law and on the existing court decisions how we're going to get to dealing with the ESA, other than unless the other parties that are involved are part of the solution.
I'm going to move away, Mr. Keppen, and over to Mr. Marcus. I hope I have that right, if he's still with us. And he had mentioned desalinization, and I was just curious what their cost per acre foot was for desalinizing water, if we still have him.
Certainly, I am here. Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. And right now, the cost of desalination, we are studying it. We are looking at probably in the range of about $2,200 an acre foot, as far as what the cost of the water would be.
Yeah, and can you scale that up if you go bigger? Does the cost drop, or are you stuck at that number?
Well, right now our board is considering a 50 million gallon per day facility. Normally on larger facilities, there are economies of scale, but for our purposes, the maximum amount is 50 million gallons.
Mr. Benz, this is Congressman Costa. Would the gentleman yield?
I yield, happily.
Mr. Marcus, those costs include a large percentage are energy related. Is that not the case?
Correct.
So for Congressman Benz answer his question, and I've heard anywhere from $2,000 plus to minus per acre foot, but if you can mitigate some of the energy costs, you can reduce the cost of the desalinization. Is that correct?
It is.
Okay. Thank you for yielding, Congressman Benz.
Thank you. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I believe that leaves Mr. Lowenthal on our side.
Oh, hold on.
Mr. Costa. Sorry, Mr. Costa. Yes. I had crossed. Yeah. So Jim Costa for 5 minutes. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I thought the testimony today has been good. I'd like to focus Mr. Hollins with self-help. The comments you made in your opening statement I thought were helpful, Tom, and I'd like you to kind of give maybe a minute or two on what you're doing in Madera County in my district to help dealing with communities with clean drinking water needs with antiquated systems.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman Costa, for the question. We are working with a variety of programs to help small, remote communities achieve a sustainable and reliable water source in perpetuity. There are some important programs from the federal level, from the EPA, also from USDA, but they need additional funds, particularly grant funds, because so many of these communities can be as small as a dozen users, perhaps up to maybe 200 or 300 users, but they just don't
many
have,
of them
they don't have the
unincorporated cities either.
Right. They're unincorporated and the counties don't have any real responsibility for them. And so it is a challenge, and it's a challenge with local leadership, but it's essential that we build reliable and resilient water sources for them. Recognizing also that I'm sorry.
No, could you share with the committee those programs and where grants can be as we're looking toward this year's budget? Because I think that'd be important for the subcommittee and for all of us to look where we could create greater access to resources to address these clean drinking water needs, especially for these small rural communities and a partnership. Dan, Kevin, you and I have worked together over the years, and I appreciate your testimony and your focus. As you know, I'm a third-generation farmer, and we know, as you've noted, stated, and others, that food is a national security issue, and where water flows, food grows. And the contention that we've had among the parties on water in the West are clearly well known for those of us who've been engaged in it. I like hearing your comments about what was tried, because I guess you and I were both a part of that effort, and how we returned back to trying to get, you said stability. I use a different word. I think sustainability is frankly the reality, because we got to have a sustainability source of water, and with climate change and the way the projects are operated. We've got in California, as you know, a groundwater management plan that is historic that we're trying to comply with. But there's more demands. The reality is there's more demands on water today than there's ever been before, when my father farmed and generations ago. How do you think it's going to require all the water management tools in our water toolbox are essential. Okay, everybody checks that box. But there's also going to be, results that are not going to be pleasant, whether that's fallowing some land permanently. That's going to create a whole source of other environmental issues. Species, you're talking about on a species by species basis. Why cannot habitat conservation plans that look at the ecosystem as a whole work in mitigating some of these water-related issues for fisheries?
Well, I know that concept was something that was teed up as part of the Klamath package, and it's been looked at elsewhere. That's the same sort of, I think, incentive-driven regulatory assurance philosophy that we're talking about, and it's more challenging, I think, when you're dealing with fisheries issues. But I think we got to keep pushing in that direction and try to get some progress, Congressman Costa.
So if the collective efforts, and the chairman and I have had our differences that are well known in the past, but sitting down and trying to work through the differences here, there's nothing like a crisis to get people's attention, and these extreme drought conditions are a crisis. How would you recommend that we start with where we were in 2015?
Are you talking about Klamath?
No, I'm talking about the West, and I'm
Yeah.
not familiar with the details in Klamath. The chairman's more familiar with that
Well,
than I am.
I would say, over on the Senate side, Senator Barrasso and his committee informally tried to deal with the ways to modernize Endangered Species Act, and they brought in a whole bunch of different groups, ag groups and manufacturing groups and conservation groups to brainstorm, and it was based on the Western Governors Association ESA report. Some sort of forum like that where you have bipartisan leaders taking a hard look at trying to improve this law that is 40, 50 years old, implemented in a way where we get real results, but you're also, looking at some of these other things that I mentioned in my testimony, food production, population growth, all those things need to sort of factor into it. So I think a forum like that, Congressman Costa, might be good. It would give us a lot of hope.
Let's try to do that, Mr. Chairman. And my sense of humor when we talk about regulatory, environmental laws that we deal with. But of course, I'm not a Los Angeles Ram fan or a San Diego Charger fan, but when they needed to build a stadium down in LA, they seemed to waive all the rules to build the stadium. And so, but that's a different subject.
Taking us back to our days in the state legislature and CEQA, of course. Well, excellent. We do need to continue this conversation on water and ESA, and particularly with the Klamath. And again, let me reiterate my commitment to being part of that conversation in a problem-solving spirit. We also need a new word, by the way, because we talk about fallowing when it comes to the agricultural impacts here. But it's not just the fish that are suffering, it's the people downstream that Ms. Cordalis represents. They have fallowed their fishery for 5 consecutive years. We got to come up with a term that reflects that part of the consideration too. But I think we got some of the right people on my screen right now to do some problem solving. And I thank the gentleman and Mr. Keppen for that conversation. So I think the last member we have here is Mr. Lowenthal. You want to back clean up there, Alan, for 5 minutes?
Yeah, I'll back clean up. I'm going to go back to Mr. Marcus and talk to, and again, thank him for his testimony and for his leadership. But I want to talk about, even though it's part of the solution, and that is how we're dealing with toxic chemicals in our cleanup, a little bit more than we've already discussed today, such as PFAS in our groundwater supplies. We're talking about, how we're going to really recycle and inject more clean water into our groundwater that's been recycled. But when we're talking about PFAS, they're harmful forever chemicals. They've been linked to cancer, to thyroid issues, other health problems, according to research by the CDC. Mr. Marcus, Mike, you mentioned that cleaning up PFAS contamination is expected to cost the Orange County Water District over $1 billion for the next 30 years. And so my question is, what additional support from the federal government can we help the Orange County Water District and other water districts that are facing similar issues of cleaning up these toxic chemicals that are in our groundwater?
Yes, thank you, Congressman, for that. And of course, part of having a resilient water supply is for us is having a clean groundwater basin. So the introduction of PFAS into our groundwater basin has caused us some significant issues. I would say our board took a very aggressive leadership position in going out and providing the cost to put treatment on all the contaminated wells. And we're in the process of doing that right now and working with our retail water agencies to overcome this problem. However, as far as the funding is concerned, right now there are several bills that are under consideration that would provide money for PFAS cleanup. And so we're watching that legislation, and would certainly be interested in participating. But when you're looking at such a large type of an issue, I think it is very important to be able to find some sort of assistance from the federal government to help local water agencies perform those cleanups.
Thank you. I want to also talk about some other types of upstream pollution, so that I become more aware of, such as blockages from wet wipes that are out there now, microplastic contamination that now we're finding is as Senator Merkley says, we ingest each week credit cards worth of microplastics into our system. These issues are not caused by water districts, yet they're expected to pay for the remediation. What can Congress do to make sure that these contaminants are addressed also? I know we're talking about PFAS, but these other contaminants, ensuring that the cleanup costs don't overwhelm your agency, because these are other serious issues that are coming into it, especially as you have that partnership between the sanitation district and also the water district.
Mm-hmm. You're absolutely correct. And a lot of those issues that you're discussing are on the wastewater side. They affect the Orange County Sanitation District.
Right.
But microplastics are an issue. I think what we can do right now is maybe take a look at the research end, making sure that we provide the research so that we can look into these different issues as far as microplastics and the impacts they may have on our water supply. And that's certainly that myself and Mr. Ensminger can take a look at. We both serve on the board of directors of the Water Research Foundation. And I know the Water Research Foundation does have some research that's looking into those issues. So providing, additional support for research, I think, is an important component to answering some of those questions.
Well, I just want to add, I'm working on a bill myself, might as well, and that's the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. I'm carrying it in the House, and Senator Merkley is carrying it in the Senate. And we do begin to look at some of the upstream prevention we talk about because of the tremendous amount of microplastics. We're talking about filters in new washing machines to capture that. This should be captured. We also have, in terms of wet wipes, there has to be a much better labeling of wet wipes. People flush them down the toilet. They don't know. They think that's what they're supposed to do. And there are things that we have to do upstream, or else we're going to leave you with the having to clean up our mess, literally. So thank you, and I yield back.
Well, I thank the gentleman, and as a legislator who once introduced a bill in Sacramento on flushable wipes, I applaud your leadership. The work we do on water is not always glamorous. It takes you into some